Late in the afternoon on May 6, 2014, 77-year-old Helene Pastor sat at her office desk in Monaco with a phone pressed to her ear. And on the other end was one of Helene's many tenants, doing what they did best, which was to complain. This time there was a problem with their water heater, and apparently the plumber was late. And Helene, like she always did, listened patiently, because she was a landlord, and this was her job. But when this tenant was finished, Helene told them in a soft but firm voice that the plumber would be there eventually, and that they, the tenant, were certainly not too important to wait. Then she hung up. Helene knew her tenant wouldn't like this, but she also just didn't have patience for entitled, wealthy snobs. Unfortunately for her, though, she spent a lot of time with people like that, because Helene was actually the single richest woman in all of Monaco. So Monaco is a country located on the Mediterranean coast, and it's surrounded on three sides by France. And so Monaco and France share a lot of cultural similarities. But unlike France, Monaco is very, very small, just under a mile wide, and has only about 39,000 citizens. And many of those 39,000 citizens are incredibly wealthy. It's essentially a country of millionaires and billionaires living in ultra-luxury condos and high-rises all along its coastline. And Helene and her family, the Pastors, owned most of those condos, which meant they were among the wealthiest landlords not just in Monaco, but on the whole planet. The Pastors' multi-billion-dollar real estate empire had started 3 generations ago, and Helene was now in charge of it. It was a lot of work, and Helene could have passed it off to somebody else. But she was a Pastor, and Pastors worked for what they had. Which was why, despite her wealth, Helene was a very hands-on landlord and spent long days in her office with her staff, dealing with accounting and handling tenants' requests and complaints, like about, the plumber not being on time. Now, Helene picked up the phone once more to make one more call before she left for the day, and this call was to her daughter, Sylvia. Sylvia was 53 and had been diagnosed with breast cancer 2 years earlier, so Helene, naturally worried about her a lot and checked in with her daily. And on this day, when she heard her daughter pick up and say hello, Helene immediately asked her, how are you feeling? But Sylvia said she actually couldn't talk right now. Her massage therapist had just arrived, and so she excused herself and hung up. Helene took the phone off her ear and just stared at the receiver as the dial tone blared through it, doing her best not to feel hurt. Helene knew she was a very demanding parent and, generally was not particularly warm, but she loved Sylvia. And lately, it seemed like her daughter just didn't necessarily reciprocate that. And Helene knew exactly who to blame for this. And it was not Sylvia, and it wasn't even Helene. It was Sylvia's boyfriend, Wojciech. Now, Sylvia had been with Wojciech for almost 3 decades, and it seemed like everyone in Monaco absolutely loved this guy. I mean, he was charming and gregarious and gave a ton of money to charity. But Helene had always felt like there was just something off about him. And she worried that he was taking advantage of her daughter's very famous name. And so generally, there had just been this sort of sitting, unspoken tension between Helene and Sylvia about Wojciech, the fact that clearly Helene didn't really like him. Like that tension was there between the mother and daughter. But lately, it seemed like that tension had finally gotten to the point where, Helene and Sylvia were just having all these little arguments that, sometimes were actually about Wojciech and other times were about completely different things. It was like they were just quick to argue with each other. But for now, Helene looked at the time and saw, it was time to go. And so she stood up and she smoothed out her beautiful Chanel suit. And she knew that if she wanted to see her son Gildo tonight, she really needed to get a move on here. So Gildo, Helene's son, had been in the hospital for the last few months after having a stroke. Helene visited with him daily, making the 45-minute drive from Monaco to where he was hospitalized in Nice, France. Now, the daily commute was definitely a lot, but Helene didn't care. She always worked it into her very busy schedule. Now, Gildo was 47, but he was still very much Helene's child. And the whole ordeal had been just awful and very emotional for Helene, especially on top of, her daughter's cancer diagnosis and the tension between her and her daughter. Like, right now, life was pretty tough. Seeing her children like this had reminded Helene that money just could not save you from everything, even in Monaco. Now, Helene grabbed her Hermes purse and she headed out the door. Minutes later, Helene was outside and was climbing into a black minivan that was waiting for her at the curb. And as Helene slid into the back seat, she was greeted by her 64-year-old driver, Mohammed Darwish. So Mohammed had actually been working with Helene now for 15 years. And so the two of them spent the entire 45-minute drive to Nice just chatting about their kids, because in some ways they were, longtime friends. Mohammed told Helene about how he really missed his daughter, who lived back in Egypt with her mom. And he also updated Helene on his son, Wissam, and how he liked living in France. Their conversation made the drive go fast, and before Helene knew it, they were at the hospital. Around 6 p.m. that night, Helene was sitting at Gildo's bedside, helping him drink a glass of water. Like his mother, Gildo had been both blessed and cursed with the pastor work ethic. Despite the family money, he was constantly starting ventures and investing in businesses. So Helene knew the hospitalization had been really hard for him, not just physically, but just from a work perspective. He was missing out on so many opportunities because he was stuck here. And even though now he was awake and alert, he was still partially paralyzed and just couldn't speak very well. Helene sat with Gildo for about an hour, talking to him and also checking in with his doctors. And then at some point, she kissed her son's forehead and told him she would see him soon. Just after 7 p.m., Helene walked out of the hospital to where Mohammed was waiting in the minivan. And this time, she got into the front passenger seat. And Mohammed, he started the car, and they began to make their way out of the lot toward the busy streets of Nice. And pretty much right away, they got stuck in absolutely standstill traffic. And so Helene just sat back in her seat and tried to relax. But as she was doing that, something caught her eye outside of the car, like out her window. It was this person who had a hat kind of pulled down low over their eyes, and they were jogging right towards the minivan. And Helene, she just stared at this person and tried to see if they maybe knew them, because it did seem like they were coming right towards this car, like their car. But then she saw what this person was holding. And immediately she screamed at Mohammed to drive. But before Mohammed could react, Helene heard a loud bang and the sound of shattering glass. About 15 minutes later, the commissioner of the Nice police, Philippe Frison, pulled up to the hospital with the sirens on. He'd been in his office, about to finish up for the day, when he got a call about shots being fired, but he really didn't know how serious it was. So he parked and jumped out of his car, and the first thing he saw was a crowd of people gathered on the street across from the hospital. And they were all staring at this parked black minivan with Monaco plates and also a shattered passenger side window. Frison jogged over, and he was technically the first officer on the scene, but a firefighter standing by the minivan told him a few details based on what he'd seen and what the onlookers had been saying. Apparently, a man dressed in black had come out of nowhere on foot and fired 2 shots into the minivan, striking both the man and the woman who were in there in the head. The shooter had then disappeared back into the crowd, and witnesses saw a second man dressed in black follow after him. The firefighter said that both victims had been taken to the hospital in critical condition, but he didn't know, if they were still alive now, and he also didn't have any information on their identities, just that it was a man and a woman. Immediately, Frison's mind went to carjacking. Now, Nice did not have a huge amount of crime, but one of its more common issues was something called the car door grab, which was when criminals would target cars who were stuck in traffic, and they would rob these cars. And so he wondered if maybe carjackers had approached this vehicle and attempted to rob it. Something happened, they drew a weapon, and then obviously the victims inside were shot, and then the carjackers took off. And so Frison radioed back to the station for backup. A crime like this, whether it was carjacking or not, obviously what he's dealing with here is murder. A crime like this needed more officers than just him. And so he gets in touch with the dispatcher and he fills her in on the need for backup. And then during this discussion, she actually passes one more piece of information to Frison that she had recently learned. And that was the identities of the victims. And the reason that they already knew who these people were is because one of the victims was incredibly famous. The woman who had been shot was Helene Pastor. The other victim was her driver, Mohammed Darwish. When Frison heard this, he couldn't believe it. I mean, of course he knew who she was. Everyone in Monaco knew who Helene Pastor was, or at least had heard the Pastor name. And so now that Frison knew the identities of his victims, his theory of this case immediately changed. He felt like there was no way the richest woman in Monaco just happened to be targeted by random carjackers. This had to be a hit. And so Frison, after getting off the radio, went back to the minivan and just looked inside. And right away, he saw there was a purse that was sitting untouched on the dashboard, which made him even more certain that this was no robbery. I mean, very likely that would have been grabbed. But then he noticed something else. The front seats and the floor of the minivan were covered in all these rounded metallic pellets, which he recognized as being from shotgun ammunition, like buckshot, like the inside of, what a shotgun fires or can fire. And this struck Frizon as being very strange. I mean, a shotgun was an odd choice for a professional hit, because it was big and bulky and you really couldn't carry it in public without attracting a lot of attention. And so this, combined with the fact that this happened in broad daylight, told Frizon that very likely whoever had shot Helene and her driver was not an experienced hitman, which was also just not what he would have expected. Just then, Frizon heard the sound of sirens cut through the air, and he knew his backup had arrived. A few hours later, Frizon was back at the police station talking to his team, which now included one of the city's very best detectives, investigator Catherine Messinio. Both of their victims, Mohammed and Helene, had survived, at least to this point. They were in comas, and their attack was already the leading news all around Europe. But Frizon was not particularly worried about, potentially not being able to solve this, because he knew he would have some answers soon. Not only had their technicians processed the crime scene and gathered swabs and other evidence from the minivan, but also Frizon's officers had found 2 security cameras near the scene that likely recorded the entire shooting. So in France, it was common for cities and towns to have like a network of closed-circuit surveillance cameras that law enforcement was able to access. And Nice had more of those cameras than any other city in the country. So Frizon was optimistic about what the footage might show once it finally arrived. But in the meantime, he wanted to speak to Helene's immediate family and friends and see if she had any enemies. The way Frizon saw it was, Helene's daughter and son, who she was very close with, Sylvia and Gildo, they would certainly know if there was anyone who wanted their mother dead. But Frizon also knew that her children were not just potential sources of critical information, they were also suspects. Frizon didn't have access to the details of Helene's estate, but he knew enough about the family to guess that whatever inheritance Helene left behind was literally in the billions, which meant that her death would likely make both Sylvia and Gildo billionaires. Now, Frizon didn't think that either of them had actually pulled the trigger here, but what Frizon did think was that both of them definitely had the motive and the means to hire somebody else to do the shooting. But Frizon had one big problem. Sylvia and Gildo, and really all of the people he really wanted to speak to, lived in Monaco. And since Frizon and his team were French, and this crime had happened in France, they had no jurisdiction in Monaco. So, in order to speak to Helene's children and her inner circle, they couldn't just walk up and demand an interview. Instead, they basically had to ask nicely. The next morning, Frizon sat in a very expensive-looking living room overlooking the beautiful Monaco harbor. Now, Frizon had been up all night and was basically running on fumes at this point, but he hoped, that was going to be worth it, because sitting across from him was Helene's daughter, Sylvia Pastor, and her 64-year-old boyfriend, Wojciech Janowski. When Frizon had reached out to Sylvia and Wojciech and asked them to speak with him, one, he had been sort of surprised at how quickly they had agreed to do it, but two, he sensed really not much emotion. Like they were sort of cold and detached and sort of quick to be like, sure, we'll meet up and chat with you about this, as if it was just no big deal. But now that he was face to face with them, it was clear that they were absolutely devastated. Especially Sylvia. Now, Frizon knew as much as he wanted to ask some sort of pointed questions here, he needed to be very careful, because Sylvia and Wojciech did not have to be speaking to him at this point. Like, they basically are just agreeing to do this interview, and at any point, they can say, enough, leave, and he would have to go. So Frizon, when he began, he just started out with some very light background questions about Helene. And in a very shaky voice, Sylvia described her mother as being very tough, but incredibly generous. She said they did fight a lot, but it was just over silly things, and they were actually, pretty close. Sylvia said she'd been battling breast cancer, and her mother had always called to check in, like she really cared. When Frizon asked about enemies, Sylvia shook her head, and she said, obviously, my mother is worth a ton of money, and so by default, she is a target. But she really didn't get out much. She didn't really engage with the Monaco social scene. She pretty much just worked all the time and looked after the family. Like, she just kept to herself. So I certainly can't think of anybody that would have wanted to harm her. When Frizon turned to Wojciech seemed equally mystified by this whole thing. He told Frizon that he and Sylvia had been together for 28 years and they had a daughter together. And so, he knew Helene very, very well. And he said that, his relationship with Helene had always been great and that Helene generally was like this incredibly generous person. I mean, especially really with him and with Sylvia. He said that even though he had his own businesses and his own income, totally separate from the pastors, Helene still would give him and his family money. The mention of finances, though, made Frizon perk up. And so he asked Wojciech to be more specific about the type of financial generosity he was describing. And when he asked that question, Frizon noticed there was this look of uncertainty that crossed Wojciech's face. And for a second, Frizon wondered if he had just touched on something that was kind of a sore spot. But Wojciech went from looking uncertain to sort of recovering very quickly, and then an easy smile came across his face, and he explained that Helene gave her daughter and son, so Sylvia, his girlfriend, and Gildo, a monthly allowance of about 500,000 euros each, which was around 600,000 US dollars. When Frizon heard this, he had to force himself not to reflexively raise his eyebrows, because this was like a staggering amount of money to get every single month as just an allowance. It was so high, in fact, that it made Frizon doubt whether either of Helene's children would feel a need to kill her. I mean, if she's already giving them this much money every month, what else do you need? But Wojciech wasn't done. He cleared his throat and sort of shifted in his seat like he was uncomfortable. And then he said that, he and Sylvia used this very generous amount of money that Helene gave them on household expenses. But, Wojciech said if he was being honest, he'd heard that Gildo spent it on other stuff. Wojciech said, Sylvia's brother, Helene's son, he owned some companies that were not doing well. And so he was in very deep debt. For Frizon, he couldn't tell if this was true or not, but it certainly opened up a new investigatory door. So he jotted down this information on his notepad. He was actually meeting with Gildo next. And so if Wojciech was right, then this debt was definitely a huge red flag. 45 minutes later, when Frizon walked into Gildo's hospital room, he was shocked by what he saw. Now, he had known that Gildo was sick, but he really hadn't been prepared for just how sick. Gildo could barely move or speak. The only way he could communicate was actually by blinking. But nonetheless, Frizon sat down by his bedside and began with a few simple questions. It took a long time for Gildo to blink out his answers, and he really couldn't communicate really anything more than a few words at a time. And it was also just kind of obvious to Frizon that even with these short answers, he just was not going to get much. And as time was going by, Gildo was just getting more and more frustrated with basically his lack of being able to contribute much here. And so by the time Frizon left the hospital, not that long after he had arrived, he was very doubtful that Gildo was really in any shape to be planning a hired hit. I mean, the guy really was just not doing well. But, it was still possible, at least Frizon thought it could be, that Gildo had begun preparations before his stroke, which had only happened 2 months earlier in March. And Frizon realized the amateurish quality of the hit itself could have actually been a product of Gildo's illness, like he had to rush the hit because he basically could barely communicate. So far, Frizon thought this case was basically full of contradictions. One of the richest people on the planet had almost been assassinated by shockingly unprofessional hitmen. Both of the children, both of Helene's kids, stood to inherit billions and billions of dollars and were therefore the most obvious suspects. But at the same time, both kids were receiving an ungodly amount of money already. Like they didn't need the money. And I mean, even if Gildo was in debt, the idea that $500,000 every month isn't enough to at least keep you afloat just seems sort of fishy. And so Frizon began to wonder about Sylvia's boyfriend, Wojciech. Could he have planned the hit? Because he, not Sylvia, wanted access to Helene's money? And so Frizon pulled out his phone and he called Massinio, the very talented detective, the best in the city, and he told her about, what he saw as issues about having Sylvia and Gildo as suspects. Massinio completely agreed with Frizon. And then she shared something that she had learned during her own interviews about Wojciech. She said that one of Helene's friends told her that Sylvia had been with Wojciech so long, 28 years, without getting married because Sylvia wanted to make sure her inheritance went to her or her child or just stayed within her direct family bloodline and didn't go to an outsider, to a husband. Frizon considered what this meant. It told him that Sylvia didn't completely trust Wojciech, but it also tanked his theory that Wojciech might have planned the hit, since he had zero claim to the Pastor estate, whether Helene was alive or not. But then Messinio said something else that made Frizon stop thinking about the Pastors completely. She said she had found something out about Helene's driver, Mohammed. Mohammed was apparently involved in a love triangle, and had been for years. He was from Egypt and he had a family there, but he also had a mistress here. And Messinio had gotten the number for Mohammed's adult son who lived with him in France, so they could just ask him about it. And so as Frizon hung up the phone, his mind was spinning. I mean, this whole time, he had thought it was so obvious who the target of the hit was. It had to be Helene. She's this billionaire. It's gotta be her. But now he was wondering if maybe the real target was Mohammed. That afternoon, Frizon was back at the station with Messinio. It had been 24 hours since the shooting, and neither of them had slept. But Frizon did not think they'd be able to do that anytime soon because the security camera footage had just arrived. And Frizon had put a lot of stock into this footage. Like, he felt really hopeful that this was going to be what they needed, because it felt like every other lead he had tried to follow so far in this case had already hit some kind of dead end. He'd just gotten off the phone with Mohammed's son, Wissam, who he had hoped, might shed some light on the possibility that Mohammed was the intended target of the attack. But Wissam had been skeptical. He did not think the lead about his father's love triangle meant very much. He said the mistress had been a part of Mohammed's life for a long time, and to be honest, nobody was particularly upset about it. Now, unlike Sylvia and Gildo, Wissam was a young and healthy man, so theoretically he could have been one of the shooters. But Frizon hadn't heard anything in their call that made him think Wissam wanted to kill his father, or Helene for that matter. So now, Frizon and Messinio began scrolling through the security footage, looking for clues that could maybe point them in the right direction. When they got to the point in the recording where the shooting actually happened, they were relieved to see they did have a clear view of the scene, and they watched it play out right in front of them. And just like the witnesses had said, Helene's car is seen turning out of the hospital parking lot, and then a man with a shotgun approached her window and fired twice. Frizon could see that the second man watched the whole thing from across the street at a snack bar, probably acting as a lookout, and then after the shooting, both men ran away on foot, and their faces were never visible in the footage. And so Frizon rewound the tape to see when these men arrived, and he saw they showed up about 20 minutes before the shooting. But it was not when they showed up that was particularly significant. It was how they showed up. When Frizon saw how they arrived, his jaw dropped, because finally he'd found a lead he could follow. Both men were separately driven to the hospital in taxis, and one of the taxi's license plates was clearly visible on screen. That evening, Frizon, Messinio, and a group of officers burst into the lobby of Hotel Azur in Nice. In Frizon's hand was a photo of both of the shooters. After calling the taxi company, everything had moved very quickly. The taxi dispatch had a record of these two men's rides and gave detectives the mobile numbers that were used to book each cab. And it didn't take long for Frizon's team to connect those numbers to two burner phones that were purchased just hours before the shooting at a store about 2 hours away from the hospital in a French city called Marseille. And then, by using closed-circuit camera footage, the police had been able to track the shooters' movements prior to the shooting. First, as they left that store with their burner phones, and then as they boarded a train to Nice, and then stopped at Hotel Azur before getting taxis to the hospital. So, that's why Frizon and his team were at the hotel now. In order to find out who planned this attack, they needed to ID the shooters. They were hoping somebody here could. So Frizon approached the reception desk with the picture of the shooters and asked the person manning it if they had seen either of the men in the photo. And the receptionist said yes. Those men had rented 2 separate rooms just the day before, but they had already checked out. And so Frizon wrote down the names the receptionist gave him for these 2 men, but the names were not familiar. Then, Frizon and Messineo split up to actually go search the rooms. Moments later, Frizon and some officers hurried into a very clean hotel room, and the receptionist had told him that this was going to be the case because the maids had already been in and out of that room. They had cleaned it. And so for Frizon, even though he did expect, a clean room, it was still disappointing to walk in there and see it because, had there been any evidence still in here, by now it was very likely gone. However, just then he heard one of his officers call out from the bathroom. And so Frizon went in there and found one of his officers pointing to where a used bottle of shower gel sat on the side of the tub. Frizon couldn't believe it. He knew no other guests had been in this room since the shooters had been, which meant that gel was almost certainly theirs. The maids must have missed it during their cleaning. And so Frizon told the officer to bag it. It was a long shot, but he wanted to maybe get it sent off and tested for DNA. On May 16, 2014, investigators Frizon and Messineo paced around Frizon's office. Every now and again, they glanced at a document that was sitting on the desk. It had only been 10 days since Helene Pastor and her driver, Mohamed Darwich, were shot outside a hospital in Nice, France. Helene was still alive and in a coma, but Mohamed Darwich had died, which meant Frizon was now officially leading a murder investigation. Now, this was daunting for Frizon, but at the same time, he felt like they were close to breaking this case, because that document on his desk told him that the shower gel they collected during a search of the shooter's hotel rooms actually did have DNA on it, and it had matched to someone in their system, a 24-year-old man named Samin Saeed Ahmed. And through a series of phone taps, they'd also managed to figure out the name of Samin's accomplice, a 31-year-old man named Al-Hayir Hamadi. Now, these names were different from the ones that the hotel had given Frizon, so clearly the men must have used pseudonyms when they checked into that hotel. Now, both of them did have prior criminal records, but like Frizon had suspected, they were not like professional killers. They were just petty criminals and drug dealers from a neighborhood in Marseille that had the highest crime rate in the entire country. So it sort of did make sense that two men from that area might agree to carry out a hit for money. But what didn't make sense to Frizon or Messineo was how Samin Saeed Ahmed or Al-Hayir Hamadi could possibly be connected to anybody in Helene's life. The Pastors and their inner circle were some of the richest people in the world. If any of them were planning a hit, Frizon would have expected them to hire, more experienced and professional assassins. So now Frizon wondered if maybe they needed to take a closer look into other areas of Helene's life, like maybe her tenants, to see if anyone had obvious connections to Marseille. He knew from speaking with Helene's friends that she often handled many of her tenants personally, and so it was possible that maybe there was a feud or dispute that they just didn't know about. However, thousands of people lived in Helene's buildings. Going through that list would be nearly impossible, which was why Frizon and Messineo had decided that the best way to approach this whole thing was with a method Frizon called the fishing rod. Instead of arresting the shooters, Samin and Al-Hayir, they would watch them and keep their phones tapped and see if they led police to whoever hired them. However, while they were figuring all this out, Frizon's phone suddenly rang, and when he answered it, he got very unexpected news. It was the hospital. Helene had woken up from her coma. And so first thing the next morning, Frizon sent Messineo to the hospital to interview Helene, and then after sending her out, Frizon waited anxiously at the station for her to return. He was hoping that Helene could simply tell Messineo who wanted her dead, and then they could just close the case. Easy. But when Messineo came back that afternoon, she did not have good news. Helene had told Messineo that she was terrified, and she had lots of things that she wanted to tell the police. And at one point, she seemed like she was on the verge of actually, giving Messineo a name or just something really meaningful. But then she'd literally just struggled to breathe, and medical staff had rushed in to stabilize her, and they hadn't been able to finish the interview. Frizon was so disappointed. They'd been so close to maybe hearing the truth directly from the mouth of their victim. And now they might never know. It would turn out 4 days later, before the police ever had a chance to have another interview with Helene, she died. Two weeks after Helene's death, so in early June of that year, Frizon parked his car and began to walk into the station to start his day. And he was feeling incredibly anxious because Helene and Mohammed's case had really stagnated, and Helene's death really only made the public pressure on him and his team way more intense. Frison still had his team watching the shooters and tracing their phone calls, but so far they hadn't gotten any more leads from that. They were also slowly chipping their way down the list of Helene's tenants, but so far they hadn't found anyone with the kind of motive they were looking for. Frison had not totally eliminated his first suspects, which were Gildo, Sylvia, and Wojciech, but he just didn't feel like any of them stood out above the rest. Gildo potentially needed a windfall because of alleged money problems, although Frison had not confirmed that with bank records. But Gildo's poor health made it extremely unlikely he could have planned this hit. Then there was Sylvia, who was entitled to an enormous inheritance from her mother's death, but she already had a massive monthly allowance when her mother was alive and really did not seem desperate for cash at all. And then as for Wojciech, he wasn't even married to Sylvia, so he literally had no legal claim to the Pastor estate. So Helene's death really didn't do him any good. So all this was sort of going through Frison's mind as he stepped inside the station. And as he did, right away he saw Messinio come running towards him carrying a piece of paper. And this paper was covered in lines of numbers that Frison immediately recognized as a call log. And Messinio explained that they had traced one of Alhair's recent calls and finally found a link to Monaco. The guy he called was somebody named Pascal Doriac, and unlike the shooters, Pascal had direct ties to Monaco. He was a personal trainer, and some of his clients were elite families who lived in Monaco. And a few of those clients were also people that Frison and his team had examined in connection with the murders. Frison grabbed the piece of paper and read and reread its contents before he finally looked up at Messinio and said they needed Pascal's phone records right now. Later that same day, Frison was sitting at his desk staring at a name written on a piece of paper. He had gotten access to Pascal's phone records, and he discovered that every time there had been a significant event in this entire case, like on the day of the actual shooting or the days of Mohammed or Helene's death, Pascal had texted the same number. And now that Frison knew who that number belonged to, he realized he had been at least half right the whole time. These murders were about money. Based on the police investigation, multiple confessions, video surveillance, and bank records, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Helene Pastor and Mohammed Darwish on the evening of May 6, 2014. Around 7 p.m., the hitman named Samin Saeed Ahmed strode toward Helene's black van. And as he did, he could see her terrified face through the passenger side window as she realized what he was carrying, a shotgun, and she looked at her driver and screamed at him to drive. But before Mohammed, the driver, could hit the gas, he had raised his shotgun and fired twice into the passenger side door. And then Samin just stood there and watched as Helene and Mohammed sort of slouched forward in their seats and began to convulse. Samin didn't know who the people were he just shot. But he wasn't thinking about that. He was thinking about the payday he was about to receive for doing this. After a moment, Samin was convinced that he had been successful, that Helene and Mohammed were dead. And so he turned and sprinted away as fast as he could, knowing that his accomplice, Alhair, would follow shortly after, just like they had planned. And so Samin, as he ran away, he pulled his baseball hat down over his eyes, hoping that would be enough to avoid any cameras that might be in the area. And he ran through the streets of Nice, eventually slowing to a walk before going inside of his hotel, where once he was inside, he went to his room, sat on his bed, and he called the man who hired him. Across the city, Pascal Doriac, the personal trainer, heard his phone ring, and he politely told the client he was with that he'd be right back. He then grabbed his phone and hurried out of the personal gym he had just been in, and he stepped into this grand marble hallway to take the call. And what he heard on the other end of the line was Samin telling him the good news, that the job was done. Pascal smiled, he hung up, and then he began typing out a text message. This text message was for the real killer, that is, the person who'd actually ordered the hit in the first place, to let them know that everything had gone off without a hitch. Seconds later, the real killer looked down and saw they had just gotten a text message, and it was from Pascal, their trainer. And as soon as they saw that, their heart began to race. They were very nervous about what this text was going to say. But eventually they scooped up their phone and they opened the message. But when the real killer read what was on their phone, they felt this enormous sense of relief that they hadn't felt in years, because their plan sort of unbelievably had worked. Then the real killer just sank back down in their comfy, expensive couch and looked out their window at an amazing view of the Monaco harbor. It would turn out Sylvia's boyfriend of 28 years, Wojciech Janowski, was lying about everything. It was Wojciech, not Gildo, who was drowning in debt. Wojciech claimed to be this very successful businessman, but in reality, all the companies that he was involved with were failing and in deep financial trouble. This had been going on for years, and Wojciech had just been swindling his girlfriend Sylvia out of her assets and monthly allowance to stay afloat. And when Sylvia was diagnosed with cancer 2 years ago, he panicked. They weren't married, so if she died, he'd lose everything. But he believed if Sylvia inherited the family fortune all at once, he could easily steal it from her and wipe out his debts. Wojciech had also been lying to investigators about his relationship with Helene. The reality was, they hated each other. Helene was very suspicious, rightfully so, that Wojciech was after the Pastor family fortune. In 2018, Wojciech was found guilty of murdering both Helene and Mohammed and was sentenced to life in prison. The other accomplices, Pascal Doriak, Samin Saeed Ahmed, and Al-Hayir Hamadi, all received between 22 years and life in prison. As for Gildo, he would eventually recover from a stroke and he moved to the United States, while Sylvia, at least as of 2025, is still alive, and she would give Mohammed's son a job and let the Darwich family live in one of her family's properties. Strongsville, Ohio used to be just another typical quiet American suburb. Nice homes, nice families, nice restaurants, and a mall. But in late 2017, a discovery was made in Strongsville that put this town on the map in the worst way possible. To understand this discovery, we need to go back to early 2016 when this town's nightmare began. In early 2016, two longtime Strongsville residents, Bruce and Melinda Pleskovic, received some very exciting news. Their 20-year-old daughter named Anna and her 20-year-old fiance named Jeff had just told them they were expecting a baby girl. And so Bruce and Melinda were totally excited about the prospect of finally becoming grandparents, but at the same time, they knew Anna and Jeff did not have very much money. Anna still lived at home with Bruce and Melinda. She did have a job, but she made very little money. She was a waitress at a local Applebee's restaurant. And as for Jeff, he had a better job working as a service technician for a heating and air company, but he didn't have enough money to support him and Anna. In fact, he didn't even have enough money to move out of his parents' home. He was still living with them on the other side of Strongsville. And so this couple, they're really excited about their baby, but Bruce and Melinda are thinking, we really got to find a way to support them because they are just not prepared for this first child. And so Bruce and Melinda, they talked it over and they decided the best way to support this young couple was to tell their daughter if she wanted to, she could invite Jeff to come stay at their house. That way the two of them could be together, and once they had their daughter, Bruce and Melinda could be the great grandparents and help take care of the baby. And in general, this would allow the couple to just continue to save money and move out when they were ready. And so when they told Anna they were willing to do this, Anna was so happy. She was so grateful. She called Jeff, and Jeff was equally happy and grateful and said, yes, I would love to move in with you guys. So it took several months, but finally in June of 2016, which was the same month that Jeff and Anna welcomed their daughter to the world, Jeff would leave his parents' home and move into Bruce and Melinda's home. And almost immediately after he moved in, he and the rest of Anna's family began experiencing some very strange and disturbing things around their property. Just a few days after Jeff had moved in, he and Anna were home alone. They were on the main floor of the house and they were having dinner at the kitchen table. And at some point, Jeff just happened to glance out one of the back windows that looked out into their backyard. And now this property had this huge sprawling backyard. Basically, they had all these houses kind of in a row, and they all had almost like a communal backyard, this big open space. And so Jeff is looking out into this huge backyard, and he sees off in the distance something strange. He doesn't really know what he's looking at because it's nighttime, it's dark, but he stands up and he walks over to the window, and as he's looking out, he sees way off on the backside of their property are these four strangers just standing there, appearing to be smoking something, and they're just kind of looking up at the Pleskovic house. And so Jeff is looking out the window at these four, not really sure what to make of them, and he calls Anna over, and so Anna walks over, and the two of them are looking out, not really sure what to do. I mean, on the one hand, these four people who they clearly didn't know, or they believed they didn't know, were definitely trespassing. But at the same time, they weren't really doing anything. They were just kind of standing there smoking. But as they're watching these four people, one of them begins walking up the property towards their home and then stops alongside the Pleskovic trampoline, which was in their backyard. And this person begins fiddling with the trampoline. And so at this, Anna's like, you know what? I don't know what they're doing. I feel totally uncomfortable. And so Anna would actually call the police. And so the police, they come out. But by the time the squad car arrived in front of the Pleskovic house, the four people in back must have seen the car and they took off running. And so when the police officer went in the backyard and looked around, there was no one there, and there was also no sign they were there. There was no dropped cigarette butts or anything. They just kind of vanished. And so the police officer told Jeff and Anna, if they come back, let us know. And so the officer left. And then a little while later, when Bruce and Melinda came home, Jeff and Anna would tell them about what happened, and they would agree that that was totally strange, that in all the decades they had lived in Strongsville, they had never had anybody stroll onto their property and just loiter in the middle of the night. And so for the next couple of days, the family was definitely on edge, but after a little while, this whole incident was largely forgotten about. Fast forward about 5 months to November 2016, and Anna was home alone with her young daughter, and she's playing with her daughter on the first floor of the house towards the front of the house. And as she's playing with her daughter, she suddenly hears what sounds like someone trying to open the back sliding glass door on the back of the house. And so instinctively, Anna thinks, okay, Jeff must be out there, or my parents must be out there, and they don't have a key or something. And so she scoops up her daughter and she begins walking towards the back of the house to open this door for them. And when she walks into one of the back rooms, before she reaches the back door, she happens to look out one of the windows that looked out into the backyard. And standing right up against the glass is this unknown male figure with his face pressed up against the glass. And so Anna just freezes and stares at this guy. And then this guy, he notices Anna and he ducks down out of view. And now Anna's thinking to herself, this is the guy. He must have been trying to break in my back door. I'm home alone. I don't know what's going on here. I don't know if he's going to try to break in again. And so she just turns and runs back towards the front of the house. She runs upstairs. She goes in a bedroom. She locks the door and she calls the police. But by the time the police come out there and they look around, they can't find this unknown figure that was at the back of the house. And there's no sign of an attempted forced entry. And so unfortunately, they told her, look, I'm sure this was very traumatic for you, but there's really nothing we can do here. There's no evidence to suggest who did this. And so please just, keep your house locked. And if you see anybody suspicious on your property, call us back. And so naturally, after the police left and Anna had a chance to contact Jeff and her parents, they were horrified and they rushed home to comfort her. And then after the initial shock of this incident had worn off, the family began to speculate, do you think this might be connected to those four strangers we saw on our property a few months ago? It just seems odd that those two things would happen so close together. And then the family began to think, okay, well then who is this person? Who are these people? What do they want? Why are they targeting us? What's going on? Because as it was, the Pleskovic family, they didn't have any enemies, at least none that they knew of. If anything, the people of Strongsville adored this family, especially Melinda, the mother. For the past 20 plus years, she had been a middle school teacher in town and her students adored her. She was also a big-time soccer coach in the community because she had played in college and she was still very passionate about it. So she was this amazing coach. And in the eyes of many parents in the Strongsville community, Melinda was a bit of an inspiration because she was not only the mother to Anna, she was also the mother of an 18-year-old boy named Kyle who had Down syndrome and was nonverbal. And Melinda just had this unbelievable way with him where she was so good to him. She incorporated him in everything. She got him so involved. She gave him the best life he could possibly have. And so anytime you saw Kyle with his mother, Kyle would be all smiles. calls. Even though Kyle couldn't speak, it was so obvious his mother made him incredibly happy. But regardless of the reason for these strangers to be lurking around their property, the Pleskovic family was now totally on edge and found themselves constantly looking out the windows, especially at night, in fear these strangers were going to come back and might try to break in again. And unfortunately, these strangers would come back. In January of 2017, so 2 months after Anna saw that unknown figure at the window and heard the back door sliding around, Bruce's car was broken into. It was sitting in the driveway of their property. Someone got inside of it and stole his laptop. And so Bruce, he calls the police and he says, I've got to believe this has to do with the people that are harassing my family. And the police believed him and they began looking around and asking around, but they could never track down the laptop or the thief. And so once again, the family was kind of left on their own. And the police said, look, if you see anything else, let us know. But there's not much we can do here. A few months later, in July of that year, Anna, Jeff, and their daughter were all home together one night when Anna happened to look out one of the back windows on their first floor, and out on the very back of the property were 3 strangers just standing in that same spot where they saw those 4 strangers smoking the year before. And these 3 strangers are just standing there looking up at the house. And so horrified, Anna calls out to Jeff and says, look, there are 3 people in the back of our property. And so Anna, she pulls out her phone and she's calling the police. And as she's calling the police, Jeff, who's totally upset that there are these people harassing him and his family and making them feel unsafe, he just grabs a flashlight and storms out the back door to go confront these people. But as soon as Jeff went out the back door, before he could even shine the light on them, the 3 people had turned and ran and vanished. And so finally, when the police did show up, they were aware of all the calls they had gotten from this family. And so they went out there and they did a serious search for these 3 strangers, but like always, nothing was found. And so the family once again was told, if you see anything else, let us know. The following month, which was August, Anna was home with her daughter, along with her mother, who was upstairs. And as Anna is in the front of the house in the playroom with her daughter, she hears the sound of somebody trying to open that back sliding door. And now immediately her radar is up because she knows what happened the last time she heard the sound. There was that person in the window. But she's thinking, okay, I can't just immediately call the police. I need to at least look and see if there's someone that I know at the back door. And so she scoops her daughter up, she stands up, and she walks around to the edge of the room she's in, and she kind of peeks her head down this hallway that will give her a clear view of this backsliding glass door. And once she finally has a full view of whoever is there, she screams because there are 2 large adults, as she would say, standing at the back door trying to force open this door. And so when she screams, these 2 strangers, they hear it, they turn around and they run. And Melinda, she was upstairs, she hears her daughter screaming, she comes flying downstairs, she's trying to figure out what's going on. Anna is hysterical, the baby's crying, and so Melinda actually calls the police about what her daughter has just seen. The police come out, they search the property, they can't find anyone, and so again, the police leave and they tell the family, look, I'm sorry this is happening to you, but we can't do anything. So please just let us know if anything else happens and we'll be out here as soon as we can. We're bound to catch these people, but right now we just don't have much to operate on. The following month, which was September, one of Melinda's car keys would go missing. And whoever had these keys, whoever had stolen these keys, would use it to randomly start Melinda's car in the middle of the night. And they also used it to set off her car alarm at odd hours of the night. And then also during this time frame that her keys were missing, they also discovered that there were nails jammed into the tires of Bruce's car. And so of course, the family calls the police and tells them about what's going on, but the police can't do anything. And so very frustrated, Melinda actually takes to Facebook and posts that someone's stolen her keys and please just give them back. And just overall, she's pleading with whoever is harassing her family to just leave them alone. But unfortunately, this post would not do anything. The harassment would continue. A month later, on October 19th, Jeff was home alone when he heard the sound of the backsliding glass door rattling. And now he knows that every time this has been heard by Anna, that there's always some stranger at the back door. And so Jeff grabs the family dog and he very carefully turns and looks down that hallway towards the back door to see who this is. And right as he pokes his head out, he sees there's this large adult figure with a hood up trying to open this back door. And so the dog sees this person and starts barking and running towards the door. Jeff runs after the dog, and this big person outside who's trying to break in, he sees the dog, he sees Jeff running, and he turns and he runs away. And so Jeff and the dog, they stay inside the house and they watch this guy just take off across the property and disappear into the trees. And Jeff would call the police, but like always, the police came out and there just was nothing they could do. 4 days later, on October 23rd, Jeff, along with his young daughter and Bruce, they went to the local Applebee's where Anna worked to have dinner there and have Anna wait on them. And then after they were done eating, they said their goodbyes to Anna, they left the restaurant, they hopped in their cars, and they drove back to their house. When they got there, Bruce was the first up the steps and he got to the front door and it was locked, and so he knocked, and Kyle, his son, he came and unlocked the door. Bruce went inside, followed closely behind by Jeff, who was holding his daughter. They get inside and Bruce walks through the house to the back of the house where the kitchen is. He flips on the lights and there's something on the kitchen floor. And when Jeff sees it, he immediately turns around and runs out of the house carrying his daughter. He grabs Kyle along the way and just takes them straight out of the house. And then once Jeff was outside, he called 911. And when you listen to his 911 call, it sounds like Jeff is unable to process what he has just seen.
911, what's the address of your emergency?
Somebody's been attacked in my house.
Somebody's been what?
Attacked.
They attacked who? Who was attacked?
Mel Pleskovic. Mel Pleskovic was attacked.
He was attacked by whom? Do you know?
She was. No, we just came home. She's on the kitchen floor.
Jeff and Bruce had just discovered Melinda lying on the kitchen floor. She'd been stabbed over 35 times and shot 3 times. She would be rushed to the hospital, but she would die that night. Although the family was in shock and couldn't even begin to process what had just happened, they were all acutely aware that whoever had done this to Melinda had to be connected to all of these strange and suspicious people that had been lurking around their property for the better part of 2 years. In fact, literally after Jeff had called 911, Bruce was inside in the kitchen kneeling next to his dying wife, and he called 911 and he would tell the dispatcher that the Strongsville Police Department really dropped the ball.
911, what city is the emergency in?
Please come to 1 for Blazing Star. I think my wife's dead. We've had people breaking into our f***ing house,
sir,
and now someone f***ing killed her.
Sir, tell me the city you need to talk to.
Strongsville, Ohio.
Okay, you need to be transferred. Don't hang up.
911, what's the city of your emergency?
Strongsville, Ohio. We have people on the way already.
What's the address?
For Blazing Star. I think someone killed my wife.
You think someone killed your wife?
Yeah, it looks like she has stab wounds on her back. We've had people trying to break into our house all year.
Sir, I need to ask you questions, okay? Are you there right now?
I just got in the door with my new son-in-law. My son Kyle was here with her.
Sir, what I want you to do is walk outside.
The Strongsville Police Department would come out in force for this case, and they would solve it in just 4 days. And when they went public with who killed Melinda, no one could believe it. Back on October 23rd, so this was the night Melinda was discovered, Jeff, along with his young daughter and Melinda and her son Kyle, they were all together in the house. And at some point, Jeff had put his daughter down in her playpen and then went into the kitchen where Melinda was. And he walked up to her, pulled out a knife, and stabbed her over 35 times. And then when Melinda fell to the ground, Jeff drew a gun and shot her 3 additional times to make sure she was dead. Now, while he was doing this, his daughter is literally just a few feet away, and Kyle, presumably, is also right nearby, but he has no way of understanding what's happening to his mother. And so with these 2 totally innocent lives just right nearby, Jeff would clean off his weapons, and he'd take off his bloody clothes, and he would hide them inside of his car, and then he would just scoop up his daughter, and he would leave the house, leaving Kyle alone in the house with his dying mother in the kitchen, just leaves him there, shuts the door, locks it, and then Jeff and his daughter would drive to Applebee's to have dinner with Melinda's husband and her daughter. And then after several hours, when they got back to the property, Jeff knew what was waiting for them inside, and he still allowed Bruce to go inside first and discover his dying wife on the kitchen floor. Very little is known about why Jeff did this, because Jeff has actually never come out and given his motive for the crime. The running theory is that Jeff actually was not going to be able to pay for the wedding, which was coming up in a couple of days, and the wedding venue had actually contacted Melinda and said, hey, we're canceling the wedding because your future son-in-law can't pay for it. And so Melinda apparently confronted Jeff about his financial troubles, and the theory is he snapped and killed her. However, that can't possibly be the entire story for why he did this, because it would turn out Jeff was found to be responsible for literally every single suspicious event that had taken place around the Pleskovic property leading up to the attack. Meaning, every time they had seen strangers lurking around their property or people trying to break into their house, that had been because of Jeff. Either it was literally Jeff outside being one of these suspicious people, or he had asked friends or hired someone or groups of people to pretend to be suspicious people on the property, or Jeff had been the only person to see these suspicious people, and then miraculously when other people attempted to look outside, they were gone. And so obviously Jeff was lying. And so I actually had the opportunity to speak with one of Jeff's childhood friends who was actually living roughly in the Strongsville area when this horrible murder took place. And what this person told me is that what is kind of generally accepted as why Jeff did this, according to the people in Strongsville, is that Jeff apparently loathed Melinda. Even though she had opened her house to him, he loathed her. And as soon as he moved in 2016, he began plotting to kill her. And so all of these suspicious events were Jeff's attempt at building this really intricate alibi that they had these strangers out there that were targeting this family, and so that when she would ultimately be killed by him, it would look like these strangers had done it. And at first, it totally worked. Everybody believed, the police, the family, friends, that strangers had broken into the house and killed Melinda. In fact, there was so little suspicion on Jeff after her murder that Jeff actually served as a pallbearer in Melinda's funeral. But ultimately, the police would discover the knife and some bloody clothes in the back of Jeff's car, and so they would arrest him and they would present this mountain of evidence against him, and Jeff would confess to killing Melinda. However, he wouldn't give any additional information about the crime. He would just basically say, yes, I did kill her. He would also never give an apology or explanation to the family. He would ultimately be sentenced to life in prison with the opportunity for parole after 33 years. During Jeff's trial, there was this totally heartbreaking moment when Bruce, Melinda's husband, spoke, and he would say their son, Kyle, does not understand that his mother is gone. And so now, every time they go out to eat, which is something Kyle really likes to do, and he used to love doing with his mother, he'll just sit and stare out the window, eagerly expecting his mother to show up any minute. But of course, she never does. In 1957, 31-year-old Larry Bader was living with his wife, Mary Lou, and their 3 kids in Akron, Ohio. Larry was a good father and good husband, but he was a terrible businessman. Over the past several years, he had launched several new business ventures, and they had all failed, throwing the family into fairly significant debt. And so even though Larry desperately wanted to be an entrepreneur and eventually start a quality business, they didn't have the money to do that. And so he had to just take some job in order to pay the bills. And so the job he got was a cookware salesman for a local company, and it did pay the bills, but it did not make Larry happy. And so on the weekends when Larry was not working, and if it was okay with his wife, he would basically just disappear and go fishing on Lake Erie, which is about an hour north of where they lived. And that was his way of kind of disconnecting from reality and kind of disconnecting from his somewhat crappy life. And so on Friday, March 15th, Larry approached his wife and said, hey, I'd like to head up to Lake Erie and go fishing for the weekend. And she would tell him, I got the kids, it's fine, you can go do that, but I heard the weather was going to be really bad. Are you sure that's such a good idea? And Larry would tell her, you know what, don't worry about it. These storms, they always hype them up. They're never a big deal. I'll be fine. And so he kissed his wife, he kissed his kids, he grabbed his stuff, he hopped in his truck, then he left and headed up to Lake Erie. That night, Lake Erie was hit with a massive thunderstorm, way bigger than the one that the news was predicting. And then the following morning, the Coast Guard discovered Larry's boat floating around on Lake Erie. There was minor damage to it, and it was missing an oar, and it was missing Larry. Larry was nowhere to be found. And so a search was launched for Larry, but he was never found, and he was eventually declared dead. And so even though the family did not have Larry's body, they would hold a funeral for him, and his wife was able to actually cash his life insurance policy, which was enough to pay for her and the kids. 8 years later, in 1965, Larry Bader's niece, a 21-year-old woman named Suzanne Peka, was in Chicago at a sporting goods show with a friend of hers. And as they're walking through the different exhibits, looking at different sporting goods equipment, they noticed over on the side of the building, there was a fairly large group of people gathered around this one particular exhibit. And so she and her friend she was with walked over to this group and they kind of pushed their way through. And in the middle of this group was this man with an eye patch and a big mustache doing an archery demonstration. Basically, he was shooting arrows into a target about 30 feet away. And so Suzanne and her friend just kind of watched this guy for a couple of minutes, and very quickly they could see why he was attracting this big crowd, because he was just an incredible archer. He was hitting the bullseye over and over and over again. But as they continued to watch this guy, Suzanne's friend started to notice something unique about him. And he eventually turned to Suzanne and said, "Hey, doesn't this guy look exactly like your uncle who went missing on Lake Erie?" And Suzanne was kind of surprised to hear him talking about her missing uncle, but she turned and looked at this guy, and all of a sudden she saw it too. He was a spitting image of Larry Bader, her uncle, although this guy had an eye patch and a mustache, but even with that, he looked exactly like Larry. And as Suzanne is watching him, she's thinking, you know, Larry was known for being this incredible archer, and here this guy is who looks just like him, and he's an incredible archer. And so after this demonstration was over, Suzanne and the friend ran over to this guy with the eye patch on, and Suzanne says to him, "Hey, I know this sounds totally crazy, but you look exactly like my uncle, Larry Bader, who went missing on Lake Erie 8 years ago." And so the guy, he hears her and he kind of smiles and says, "You know, I'm sorry, I don't know Larry Bader. My name is John Johnson. People call me Fritz. I'm sorry, I don't know who your uncle is. I can't help you." But Suzanne, as she stood there staring at this guy, she was becoming more and more convinced this was Larry Bader, despite the fact this guy is saying he is not Larry Bader. And so she says to him, "No, you are Larry Bader. I'm positive you're my uncle." Now at this, Fritz would be polite but firm, and he would reiterate that, "Look, I'm not your uncle. I don't know who Larry Bader is. I don't go to Lake Erie. I just don't understand why you think I'm him. I live in Omaha, Nebraska with my wife and my kids, and I'm on TV. I do sports journalism in Omaha, and I advise archery companies, and that's why I'm here. So I don't know why you think I'm your uncle, but I'm not. I'm sorry." And with that, Fritz turned around and he walked away. And after this discussion, Suzanne and her friend were not remotely deterred from what Fritz was saying. They were completely convinced this was Larry Bader. And so they ran to a phone, and Suzanne called her two other uncles, so Larry Bader's brothers, and she explained how she met this guy that is the spitting image of their brother. And they immediately hopped on a flight that night and flew to Chicago. And the following morning, the two uncles, along with Suzanne and her friend, they went back to the sporting goods show. They went over to the archery exhibit, and sure enough, there was Fritz doing his archery demonstration. And as soon as there was a break, Suzanne, her friend, and now the two uncles, so Larry Bader's brothers, they walk over, and the two uncles, as soon as they see this guy, despite the eye patch, despite the mustache, they too would say, "This is our brother." And so they approached him and they said, "Look, I know you're saying you are not our brother. I don't know what's going on here, but you look exactly like our brother, and we have his military paperwork right here with fingerprints. Will you please just humor us and go to the police station with us and get fingerprinted? That way you can prove you really are not our brother. Please, we've been looking for our brother for a long time. This would be a huge favor to us." And so Fritz was annoyed. He didn't want to do it, but he's like, "Okay, fine. I'll go to the police station with you. I'll get my fingerprints taken, and we can put this behind us." And so that day they left the sporting goods show. They went to a police station, and Fritz had his fingerprints taken. And afterwards, the police would tell him, "You are Larry Bader." When Fritz heard this, he could not believe it. I mean, he literally did not believe he was Larry Bader. It wasn't like this revelation prompted new memories and suddenly he recalled it all. It was really the opposite. Fritz immediately is trying to rack his brain to figure out, like, is my whole life a lie? But there was nothing. All he had was a contiguous stretch of memories from when he was a very young child as Fritz Johnson all the way to the present. But we now know that the bulk of his memories are all not real. He was never a child as Fritz Johnson. He was Larry Bader and then became Fritz Johnson only 8 years earlier. The timeline of what happened to Larry Bader is rough at best, but as far as we understand it, Fritz Johnson showed up in Omaha, Nebraska a couple of days or a couple of months after Larry Bader went missing on Lake Erie. And when Fritz showed up in Omaha, he just walked into a restaurant and asked for a job there, and he had provided documentation that showed he was in fact Fritz Johnson, and nobody thought anything of it. He was completely normal. There was nothing unusual about his behavior, and over time, Fritz just kind of thread himself into the Omaha community. I mean, he got married, he had a child, he adopted another child, he left his job as a bartender at a restaurant and eventually got this amazing job as a sports TV broadcaster for their local channel. I mean, he was like a minor celebrity in Omaha. Everybody recognized, oh, there's Fritz Johnson, he's on TV, hey Fritz, how you doing? I mean, he had a full-blown life. But as soon as the news broke that he was not Fritz Johnson, he was Larry Bader, right away, the TV station he worked for fired him. His second wife left him because in reality, he actually was still legally married to his first wife. And so his marriage to his second wife was never actually real to begin with. And so she leaves him. And then also because Larry Bader was no longer dead, the insurance company that had paid out all that money to his first wife as part of his life insurance policy, they demanded that he repay them. And throughout all this drama of Fritz finding out he's Larry Bader, Fritz continued to say he was not Larry Bader, that this was all a big mistake. He just could not understand how this could have happened. None of it made sense. And so eventually a team of experts, doctors, psychologists, you name it, they came out to Omaha and they ran Fritz, aka Larry Bader, through a battery of tests over almost 2 weeks. And at the end of all their testing, they concluded that one, Fritz definitely is Larry Bader. So there's no debate there. He is Larry Bader. And two, he is almost certainly suffering from an extreme case of amnesia, which is memory loss. But the doctors and experts had no idea how he developed this case of amnesia. And of course, Fritz, he too had no idea how he developed this case of amnesia. And it's unlikely we'll ever get any more clarity on exactly what happened to Larry Bader / Fritz, because unfortunately, just 1 year after it was discovered Fritz was Larry Bader, Fritz would die. He had cancer in one of his eyes, and that was actually why he wore that eye patch, and the cancer had come back and it took his life. Today, his case is considered to be one of the most believable and baffling cases of amnesia on record. Before we get into our next story, I want to talk to you about today's sponsor, HelloFresh. Back during the beginning of the pandemic, we were not able to get groceries or have food delivered to our house. And so before long, we were down to eating just the Diet Cheetos and pickled licorice. And as I was eating my 77th bag of Diet Cheetos, I thought to myself, is there anything better for me to eat? And that's when I discovered HelloFresh. HelloFresh is like one of those things where as soon as you have it, you think to yourself, how could I have ever lived without this? They send you this neat little box full of meals, and there's all these incredible meals to choose from fairly intricate to very quick and easy. And so whatever your tastes are, they got it. But the catch is they are not made. You are the chef and you make the meals. And before you tell me that you're a bad chef, I'm a bad chef, and I'm able to whip these meals together no problem because all the ingredients are perfectly proportioned, which also means you don't waste any food, and the recipes are incredibly easy to follow. So the end product is home-cooked, fresh, delicious food every time. So if your New Year's resolution is to eat better or to just stop snarfing as many Diet Cheetos, then you really need to sign up for HelloFresh. To do that, go to HelloFresh.com, use the code MrBallen16 to get up to 16 free meals and 3 surprise gifts. Okay, back to the stories. Just outside of the popular tourist town of Amaga in northern Colombia lies this thick green jungle. And if you know where to look, there is actually a walking path that leads you from Amaga deep into this jungle. And if you keep going, it will bring you all the way to this terrifying, enormous old railroad bridge that spans this huge ravine. Now, this bridge is no longer used by trains. It's been decommissioned. However, since its decommissioning, there's actually been, ironically, more traffic on this bridge, although so it is the foot traffic variety. People come out to this bridge to go bungee jumping. Bungee jumping is a thrill-seeking activity where people will leap off of high places, like this bridge, and they'll jump with an elastic rope tied to their ankles. And so this rope has been very carefully measured so that when it is fully stretched all the way out, it ensures whoever has jumped will still not impact the ground. Back in early July of 2021, a 25-year-old Colombian lawyer named Yesenia Gomez, who lived about an hour north of Amaga in the larger city of Medellin, she told her boyfriend that she wanted to go bungee jumping. This was something Yesenia had talked about for a long time, wanting to go bungee jumping, but every time it became a real thing and they were actually going to go do it, she would back down because she was just too scared. But for whatever reason, in July of 2021, Yesenia had the confidence and the courage to actually see this thing through. And so her boyfriend, when he heard how serious she was, he capitalized on the opportunity because he had never bungee jumped before and he really wanted to, but he couldn't without his girlfriend. And so now it seemed like she was serious. And so right away, he called the Amaga bungee jumping company to book a slot for he and Yesenia to jump off of their bridge. So on the day they were supposed to jump, which was Sunday, July 18th, Yesenia and her boyfriend hopped in their car and they drove an hour south to Amaga. And when they got there, they found the walking trail and they made their way out to this bridge. And when they get out to this bridge, they are amazed at the number of people who were already in line on this bridge waiting to jump off of it. They knew this was a popular spot, but perhaps they didn't realize just how popular it was. And so Yesenia and her boyfriend, they get in line behind the nearly 100 other jumpers ahead of them, and they proceed to wait. And over the next several hours, Yesenia and her boyfriend would have front row seats to all of the jumpers ahead of them jumping off the bridge. Now, it seems like Yesenia, in her mind, believed she would arrive at this bridge and very quickly she and her boyfriend would leap off and it would be great and so much fun. But now they've been forced to wait for a really long time. And this whole time, they're watching other people jump. And Yesenia is starting to panic. Suddenly, bungee jumping looked terrifying. It did not look like something she wanted to do. And so she was beginning to second guess her decision. And so her boyfriend, he's trying to calm her down and he's telling her, oh, it's totally safe. Look at all these people who have jumped. They're all fine. They're all smiling. They're so happy. You're going to be so proud of yourself. But despite his best efforts to calm his girlfriend down, Yesenia just could not calm down. But she did tell her boyfriend that she's not about to back down. She's going to go through with this. And so several hours went by of this totally high stress, anxious waiting period. And then finally, Yesenia and her boyfriend reached the front of the line, at which point the staff members who've been doing this all day long, they signaled the two to step forward and get their harnesses on. And so Yesenia and her boyfriend, they make their way to the edge of the platform. So they're looking out over this ravine and the staff members are putting on their harnesses and getting them ready. And the whole time, Yesenia, she's starting to get tunnel vision. Her heart is racing. She's totally panicked. She doesn't think this is fun at all. She just wants to get this over with. And then at some point, one of the staff members finally says, okay, jump. And so Yesenia jumps. Except it would turn out Yesenia had made a mistake. That staff member who had said, okay, jump, was talking to her boyfriend, not Yesenia. However, Yesenia, in her totally panicked state, had just not understood and had leapt, believing they were telling her to jump. However, the staff members had only put her harness on. They had not attached the actual elastic rope to her ankles. And so when Yesenia jumped, there was nothing stopping her from smashing into the ground. And so as soon as she leapt off the bridge, her boyfriend ripped off all of his gear and he ran down the bridge. He leapt over the railing and he ran down the hillside all the way to the bottom of this ravine. But when he finally got to his girlfriend, it was already too late. She was already gone. It would later be determined Yesenia did not die from impacting the ground. She actually died from a heart attack she suffered on the fall down, which means she must have realized after she jumped that she jumped too early, that she did not have the bungee cord attached to her legs. And so literally the fear of what was about to happen to her killed her. In early 1974, 31-year-old Michael Taylor was living happily with his wife Christine and their 5 children in Ossett, which is a small town in central England. Michael was described as a great father and a great husband who had an excellent sense of humor. In fact, neighbors, whenever they would walk past the Taylor household, would say you could often hear the sound of Michael laughing or the sound of him telling jokes to his family. But in April of that year, everything changed for the Taylor family. Michael had been doing some home repairs when he fell off of a ladder and he hurt his back. The injury itself was fairly minor, but it resulted in chronic pain. And this chronic pain quickly changed how Michael behaved. Michael went from being this cheerful, funny, happy guy to being sad and depressed. And he was so irritable that his family could barely be around him because he would lash out at them. Now, the Taylor family was not a religious family. However, most families who lived in Ossett at that time were. And so when one of Michael's friends found out about how poorly Michael was doing, they approached Michael and said, you know, you really ought to turn to religion for help and for guidance in this difficult time. And they also told him specifically that he really ought to check out this one particular Christian group. It was called the Christian Fellowship Group, and all it was a prayer group for Christians who wanted more religious support beyond just going to church on Sundays. But this friend of Michael's told him that the real draw of this group was the group's leader. Her name was Marie Robinson, and she was this 21-year-old, extremely friendly and energetic and charismatic person who just had this incredible way of making all of her members really feel like they belonged. And so Michael's friend was telling him that he really thought Marie could be the difference maker for him, that she could help him get back to normal. And so Michael, you know, he trusted this friend and he really didn't have much to lose at this point. He was already at rock bottom, and so he agrees to go check this group out. So on September 12th of that year, Michael makes his way to the church where this fellowship group is held. He goes inside and he makes his way to one of the back rooms in the church. And when he goes inside, he sees there's a ring of people sitting in a circle, about 20 people. And as soon as they see Michael coming in the room, they all stand up and they open their arms up and they say, come on, come sit down with us. Welcome to the group. And then the woman who had to be Marie, she stands up and she looks at Michael, huge smile on her face, and she encourages him to come over and sit right next to me. Welcome. We'd love to have you join our group. And so Michael, for the first time in ages, is smiling as he strides across the room and sits down right next to Marie. And then as Marie began to lead the group in prayer, Michael did not feel his chronic pain. He just felt happy again. But when the meeting was over and Michael went back home again, the pain and depression came flooding back. It was like the only place he could be happy was inside of the church at this fellowship group. And so over the next couple of weeks, Michael completely prioritized this group. He went to all of their meetings, and over the course of these couple of weeks, Michael became very close with Marie, and apparently Marie became very close with Michael, to the point where the two of them would stay after the meetings were over, and just those two would sequester themselves in quiet prayer. No one knew what they did in there, but it just seemed like they were developing a real relationship. And in fact, many people in this group suspected they were having an affair. And before long, the rumors in the church had spread outside and were all over Ossett. And then before long, Christine, Michael's wife, was hearing from a friend or a neighbor that apparently Michael was having an affair with Marie. Now, Christine had already suspected her husband was having an affair with Marie because Marie was the only thing Michael talked about when he got home. So on October 1st of that year, only a couple of weeks after Michael had first attended this group, Christine waited until Michael had left the house to head out to one of the group meetings, and then Christine hopped in her car and she followed him to the church. And when she got there, she parked her car, she took a deep breath, and then she got out, she made her way to the front doors of the church, and she stormed inside, and she found the room where these meetings were held. She barges in, and she points at her husband, and she says, I know you're having an affair with Marie, and you're going to admit it in front of this whole group. And Michael, who's sitting with his back to his wife in one of the chairs, he stands up, and instead of addressing his wife, who's accused him of infidelity, he turns and looks at Marie on the other side of the room. And when Marie made eye contact with Michael, she screamed. She would later say Michael did not look human. He looked like a beast, and he had wild eyes. And so as Michael is standing there staring at Marie with this very aggressive face, he began breaking out in tongues. Speaking in tongues is where the speaker will be saying or uttering words or sounds that sound like language, but the speaker doesn't know what they mean. The idea is some entity has come inside of their body, and this entity is dictating their speech. And so Michael is broken out in tongues. He's barking these words and sounds at Marie, and everyone inside of the room has no idea what to make of this. Everything has happened so suddenly, and it's so surprising. You have the wife suddenly coming in and aggressively accusing her husband of cheating, and Michael is not responding to it, and he's acting totally crazy. And then before anyone can do anything, Michael goes from just barking in strange languages at Marie to suddenly rushing across the room as if he's going to attack her. And when he does that, the rest of the members jump on top of him and hold him down. And despite there being like 10 or 15 people holding him down, Michael is still trying to get up, and he's screaming and snarling and yelling at Marie. And then Marie suddenly breaks out into tongues too. And it's only then that Michael stops trying to force himself up out of this pig pile that's on top of him, and instead he just continues to speak in tongues to her. And so the two of them are looking at each other speaking in tongues, and the rest of the group is just totally dumbfounded, and so they just begin praying. And then after about an hour, Michael just collapses. It's like he went unconscious. And at that point, everybody in the room just goes silent, and they look at Michael, and then Michael kind of opens his eyes, and it's almost like he's waking up, and he begins looking around frantically, trying to figure out what had just happened. Michael would claim he had no memory of what had just happened to him. And so at this point, Marie would tell him and Christine that she believed Michael was possessed by a demonic force, and the only thing they could do at this point would be to perform an exorcism. An exorcism is an expulsion or attempted expulsion of a supposedly evil spirit inside of a person or a place. Michael and Christine were at a loss. They had no idea what to do in this situation. They were both kind of in shock for very different reasons, and so they just kind of deferred to Marie's judgment and said, yeah, I think an exorcism is the way to go. So Christine and Michael just leave the church and go home, and then the next morning, Marie would get in touch with the Anglican Church of England and would request an exorcism. And after hearing about what was going on with Michael, the Anglican Church would say, yeah, that does sound like he needs an exorcism. And so the following day, they would send out two of their best exorcists named Peter and Raymond. And so Peter and Raymond, they get to Ossett, they go to Michael's house, and they observe him, and very quickly they determine that it does seem like Michael is possessed by at least one demonic force. And so they tell Michael, the only thing we can do here is perform this exorcism, but we need you to agree to it. And so Michael says, okay, yeah, I agree to this exorcism, and so would his wife, because she at this point is just completely unsure what to do. She's just going along for the ride. So a day later, on October 4th at 10 p.m., Michael, his wife, and the rest of the members of this fellowship group, along with Peter and Raymond, they would all meet at this other church in a neighboring town. And as soon as Michael had been positioned in the middle of this group in this chair, Peter and Raymond began the ritual by praying. And as soon as they did, Michael began screaming out in tongues, and he began writhing around, and he fell to the ground, and he began contorting his body in grotesque positions as if the words Peter and Raymond were saying were physically harming Michael. And so after 8 hours of this, during which they had to actually tie Michael down to prevent him from hurting other members or hurting himself, after 8 hours, they finally just came to a stop. Peter and Raymond were exhausted. It looked very much like Michael too was exhausted, and as soon as they stopped the ritual, Michael just kind of collapsed on the ground as if he had fallen unconscious. And then at some point he kind of wakes up and he's looking around wildly. He's still tied down to the ground, and he's acting like he has no idea what's just happened. And at this point, Peter and Raymond, they tell him that, the exorcism was mostly successful. We identified 40 demons inside of you, and this exorcism was able to expel 37 of them. So that means there's still 3 demons inside of you. Now, we can't do it right now. We're too tired. You're too exhausted. So go home, get some rest, and tomorrow we will finish this exorcism. We will get rid of those 3 demons, and you will be just fine. And so Michael and Christine, they get their things, and they leave the church, and they head home. A few hours later, around noon, a woman who lived near where Michael Taylor and his family lived thought she heard something strange outside of her house. It sounded like someone yelling. And so she went to the front of the house, and she pulled the curtain aside on one of her windows, and outside, walking down the street completely naked, covered in blood, was Michael Taylor, and he was saying something about Satan. And so this woman, she calls the police show up, and they find Michael. He had curled up on the sidewalk outside of this woman's house, and he was giggling like a child in the fetal position. And so the police approach him, and at some point Michael apparently snaps out of it, and he starts looking up at the police, police like he has no idea what's going on, and eventually they would get him to tell them his name and where he lived. And so after calling in backup to deal with Michael, the responding officers made their way to Michael's residence. And so they go inside, and immediately, as soon as they see what's in there, one of the officers just turns around and runs outside and begins dry heaving. The inside of the Taylor family home would become one of the most infamous crime scenes in English history. A few hours earlier, when Michael and his wife had come home from the exorcism, they had gone inside, and then Michael had fallen into one of his trances and began beating his wife. And then at some point, she fell to the ground and either was dead or was in the process of dying, at which point Michael jumped on top of her, and using only his hands, he ripped her face off and flung it across the room. And then as she's laying there bleeding to death, he began rubbing her blood all over his body. And then after she had finally died, he tracked down the family dog and killed the dog as well. Fortunately, their 5 children were not home at the time of this attack, and so they were unharmed. During Michael's trial, the prosecution and the defense blamed the Anglican Church of England and Marie and her religious group for effectively convincing Michael he was possessed with demons, which caused him to act out violently and kill his wife. And so ultimately, Michael would be found not guilty by reason of insanity, and after only 4 years of psychiatric care, he was released. And today, he is still living free in Ossett. But despite the legal outcomes of this case, there are many people, both religious and not religious, who believe the Michael Taylor case is one of the only true demonic possession cases in modern history. Also, just to close the loop, we don't know for sure if Michael and Marie were having an affair, but it is assumed they were. The Sierra Madre Oriental is a major mountain range that starts on the southern border of Texas and Mexico and cuts 700 miles south through the northeastern section of Mexico. About halfway down this mountain range on the eastern face lies a series of caves, and situated below these caves at the foot of the mountains are several small villages that are very isolated, and they're populated primarily with illiterate poor farmers. One night back in May of 1963, a 14-year-old boy named Sebastian Guerrero, who lived in one of these small isolated villages, decided to go for a walk up in the mountains, and he wanted to go explore the different caves. Now, this was something he did fairly regularly because there was a local rumor that there was actually hidden treasure in these different caves. Now, it's unclear if Sebastian literally believed that or if that was just kind of an excuse to go have a look around himself. But regardless, he headed out of his house and he began walking up the mountain towards these caves. The entrance to these caves were a couple hundred feet up the mountainside, and then each of the various entrances, which ranged in size from fairly small to enormous, were spread out a couple of miles in each direction. So Sebastian starts walking up the mountain towards the first entrance he can see. It's dark outside, he's got no flashlight, he's just walking up, and as he's walking, he notices off to his right, fairly far away from where he was, there was light coming out of one of the cave entrances. And he had never recalled seeing light coming out of any of these caves. Nobody ever went in these caves, especially not at night. And so his interest was piqued, and he decided he would kind of abandon his original plan to just kind of look around near his village, and he would actually walk all the way over to that lit up cave and see what was going on. So he turned right and began kind of walking uphill at an angle in the direction of this lit up cave. And so as he's walking, he's getting farther and farther away from the village where he lives, and he's starting to hear sounds coming out of this lit up cave entrance. It sounds like a person potentially, either they're laughing or they're screaming. He doesn't really know. He's thinking, maybe someone's having a party inside one of these caves. He has no idea. But after he gets maybe 200 or 300 feet away from this entrance, he realizes it's definitely a person, and they're definitely screaming. And it does not sound like they're screaming out of joy. It sounds like they're screaming because they're scared or they're in pain. And as he's getting closer and closer and closer to this cave, his anxiety is starting to ramp up because he's really starting to be frightened by what he's hearing, and he's starting to realize there's more than one person inside of this cave. In addition to the person that is screaming out, there also sounds to be a large contingent of other people that are either singing in unison or chanting in unison, but some group of people are doing something in unison while some other person is screaming out. And so he's really starting to get nervous about this cave, but he just can't help feeling curious about what was going on. And so he just continued walking until he was maybe 10 feet away from the entrance to this cave, and he plopped down behind a rock. And so so he's not really sure if it's a good idea to look. He doesn't want to be spotted by whoever is in there. But finally, he kind of works up the courage. He takes a deep breath and he slips out from behind the rock and he goes right to the edge of this big opening, maybe 10 foot across opening. And he peeks his head right around the edge of the opening and he looks inside. And what he sees causes him to just freeze in terror. Then his survival instincts just kick in and he turns and he starts running down the mountain away from this cave. He has no idea if he's been spotted or not, but he's sensing that someone could be chasing him. And so he is just running as if his life depended on it. And he would not run back to his village. Instead, he would run nearly 10 miles to the nearest police station. And when he gets there, he busts through the front doors and he's totally hysterical. He's drenched in sweat and the police officers are totally caught off guard. And so they're trying to tell him to calm down. And so Sebastian finally would kind of compose himself, but then he just was not able to describe what he had seen inside of this cave. Whatever he had seen, he knew it was bad, but the words were just escaping him. And so the way he described it to police was he basically thought he saw vampires. And as soon as he began describing vampires to the police, they're thinking to themselves, okay, I don't know what's going on with this kid, but this just cannot be serious. And so they consoled him and kind of calmed him down and said, look, kid, I don't know what you're talking about. If there's any news that comes out of something happening in the cave that's bad, I'm sure we'll hear about it and we'll follow up. But for now, we're just going to bring you back to your village. And so at this, Sebastian was really frustrated and he was kind of pleading with the police like, no, you got to take me seriously. There's something bad happening in this cave. Someone could be hurt. Someone could be dying. I don't know, but you got to go to this cave. You got to go see what's going on. But the police at this point, they're just not really interested. And so they ultimately do just drive him back to his village. And so he goes back into his home. The police go back to their station and everyone just kind of goes to bed for the night. The next day, when Sebastian wakes up, he just can't shake what he saw inside of that cave. And so he would once again run back to the police station. And when he got there, he began pleading with the police like, you gotta go see what's inside of this cave. I'm telling you, there's something awful in there. And this time, one of the police officers, his name was Luis Martinez, he would say, okay, kid, bring me to this cave and I'll have a look around. And so Luis and Sebastian, who was very grateful, they left the police station, they hopped in a police car and they took off. And then later on in the day, the other police officers who were not really paying attention to this cave thing, they realized that Luis and the boy had not returned yet. And Luis had not checked in via his radio. And so at some point in the afternoon that day, the other officers began calling out to Luis. They began calling him on his radio and trying to figure out what's going on, but he wasn't responding. And so the police thought that was odd, but they thought, you know what, I'm sure he'll be back soon. There's got to be an explanation for this. But the rest of the day would go by without Luis reaching out to them, and he didn't return with the boy. And so by that evening, the other officers were genuinely concerned that, something bad had happened to their colleague. And so they tried calling Luis a few more times on the radio. It didn't work. And so the officers, they made their way over to Sebastian's village and they found Sebastian's family, believing that, maybe the boy was back and he could give some insight into where Luis went. But when they talked to Sebastian's family, they would say, hey, he's not back yet either. And so both Sebastian and Luis at this point have not talked to anyone all day and they are missing. And so the police at this point, they realized this is an emergency. They need to figure out where these two went. And so they were kind of understaffed. And so they contacted the Mexican army and they explained, we're missing one of our colleagues. We're missing a child from this village. And so the Mexican army would actually send out a military unit to assist them in going and finding these two people. And so the unit, they show up later that night and the police and the Mexican army, they head out to where this cave was. And when they saw what was inside the cave, it would shock the world. To understand what was found inside of this cave, we need to go back 6 months to December of 1962. That month, two brothers, Santos and Cayetano Hernandez, who made their living basically traveling around Mexico, stealing from people and swindling people, they decided they were going to pull off their biggest heist yet. They were going to rip off an entire town. Their plan was to go into a small, fairly isolated village that was populated primarily with poor and illiterate people, and they would go in there and they would convince the villagers that they, the brothers, were actually prophets of an exiled Incan god. And if these villagers did everything they said, they would make them rich. And so the village the brothers identified as their target was a place called La Yerba Buena, which was located right at the foot of the Sierra Madre Oriental, right below where that cave was that Luis and Sebastian went to investigate. And La Yerba Buena was exactly what the brothers were looking for. It was home to only about 20 families that were all very poor and illiterate, and they were very suggestible. And so right before the new year, the Hernandez brothers strolled into La Yerba Buena, and they put on this very dramatic show explaining how they were the prophets of the Incan god. And these two brothers, they were very charismatic and they were excellent salesmen. And so they really sold the lie. And these villagers who were very vulnerable and cut off really from the rest of the world, they believed them. They thought this was their big break. They're going to be rich. We just have to do whatever they say. And so almost immediately, the villagers effectively became the Hernandez brothers' slaves. They would give them anything they wanted and do anything they wanted. But after a couple of months of this, some of the villagers started to be frustrated with the Hernandez brothers, the prophets, because it seemed like they were not really working towards making the villagers rich. Instead, it just seemed like they were horribly mistreating the villagers. And it just didn't feel like this was a relationship that was benefiting the villagers. And so when this sentiment began to kind of make its way around the 70-ish people who lived in La Yerba Buena, the brothers picked up on it, and they could have, at that point, just kind of abandoned their gig. At this point, you know, they've robbed the town dry. There's nothing left for them to give to the brothers. But for whatever reason, the brothers decide instead to salvage their operation. And so the brothers, they leave the village and they go to a city that's relatively close by, and they recruit this young woman named Magdalena Solis. She was a prostitute, and they tell her, hey, you know, we have this con we're doing in La Yerba Buena where we're pretending to be prophets of this Incan god, and they're starting not to believe our lie. And so we need you, if you're willing, to come with us and pretend to be an actual Incan goddess. And so when you show up, they'll know that we were serious, that we have a direct line to the Incan gods and goddesses, and they'll believe us again, and they'll fall back in line. And so Magdalena, she likes the idea of participating in this con, and so she agrees to do it in exchange for some money. And so she, along with the Hernandez brothers and Magdalena's brother, his name was Eliezer, and he functioned as her pimp, those four people, they went back to Yerba Buena, and when they got there, the Hernandez brothers snuck Magdalena past all the villagers up to that cave up in the mountains. And they put her in the back of the cave. They kind of hid her behind some rocks, and they dressed her up in an Incan goddess costume. And then once she was in there, the brothers went back down to the village, and they rounded all the villagers up and said, come on, let's go up to the cave. We have a special ceremony for you. And so the villagers made their way up to this cave. And once they were all inside, the Hernandez brothers used some basic magic tricks and created basically a smoke screen. Once they had this smoke screen kind of billowing in the back of the cave, they secretly signaled to Magdalena, who was behind the smoke screen, and she knew that was her cue, and she leapt through the smoke and she presented herself to the villagers for the first time, and she declared herself to be a reincarnated Incan goddess. And if you don't do what I tell you to do, I'm going to kill you. And so the message she was sending to the villagers was so intense, they completely believed that this was an Incan goddess, and therefore this was not a ruse. The brothers were not lying to them. This was all very real. There's a real goddess in front of us. And so they immediately fell right back in line. The plan worked exactly as the brothers wanted it to. However, there was an element of their plan they could not possibly have accounted for. And that was what Magdalena did next. Even though Magdalena was fully aware that what she was getting herself into was an act, it was a con, it was not real. Despite that, as soon as she jumped through the smoke and was standing in front of the villagers for the first time and saw the looks on these people's faces as they stared up at her, and she saw their reverence for her, it had this profound impact on her. This is a woman who's never had control in her life. She's been a prostitute since a young age, and here she is, the most powerful person in the room, and it's not even close. And it got to her head. And so when she left the cave that night, she literally believed she was a reincarnated Incan goddess, and she was not a merciful one. Within the first few days of her stay at La Yerba Buena, Magdalena used threats of violence on the villagers to completely take over the village. She very easily supplanted the Hernandez brothers at the top of the power structure. Now, the Hernandez brothers probably were quite surprised to see this happen because they were expecting Magdalena to play more of a prop role to keep them in power, not the other way around. But ultimately, they kind of just went along with it because through Magdalena's control over the villagers, they were able to continue to exploit the villagers. And so they were getting what they wanted out of this relationship. Within a few weeks of being in La Yerba Buena, Magdalena was not only abusing every villager in every horrible way imaginable, she also was becoming completely delusional. She convinced herself that in order to survive, she needed to start drinking blood. And so she demanded all the villagers provide her with blood, and so in fear of retribution, the villagers began slaughtering all of their farm animals and their own pets so Magdalena could drink their blood. For weeks and weeks and weeks, the horrible abuse Magdalena would dole out on the villagers would continue, and these blood rituals would continue. And then finally, sometime in April, 2 of the villagers decided, you know what? I've had enough. I don't believe Magdalena is actually an Incan goddess. I don't believe the Hernandez brothers are actually prophets. I think this is all a scam. And so they decided the way they would handle this is they were just going to flee the village. Now, somehow their plans to run away got out, and the Hernandez brothers found out about it, and they, in turn, told Magdalena about it. And when she heard the news, she immediately told everyone in the village to make their way up to the cave for a special ceremony. So all the villagers, including the 2 people that were planning on running away, they made their way up to the cave, and once everyone was inside, Magdalena walked to the front of the group, and she pointed at the 2 dissenters, the 2 people that were planning on running, and she demanded that the rest of the villagers kill them. And on the spot, all of the other villagers jumped on top of the 2 dissenters and they lynched them. They beat them to death in the cave. And then after these 2 people have been killed, Magdalena orders their bodies be strung up on these 2 pikes she had set up in the back of the cave because she knew what she was going to be doing up in this cave. And so after these 2 bodies were strung up on these pikes, Magdalena grabs a chalice and she walks over to these 2 bodies and she presses the chalice up against their bodies where they're bleeding from, and she fills it up and then she drinks from the chalice. And at this point, everything changed. Suddenly, Magdalena understood that it wasn't good enough to just be drinking animal blood. That was not enough to keep her, a goddess, alive. She now could only consume human blood. And so for the next several weeks, periodically, Magdalena would order everyone in the village to go back up to the cave for a blood ritual, which they all knew what this entailed. This no longer had anything to do with animals. This was human blood rituals. She would order them up and they would have no idea who was going to be the sacrifice. And so all these people, they get inside this dark cave, and then Magdalena shows up and she stands in front of them, and after kind of looking them over, she identifies her next sacrifice, and out of fear, the other villagers, who were the friends and family of the victim, would launch themselves on top of the chosen sacrifice and lynch them in the cave. And then afterwards, their body would be strung up on one of the pikes, and Magdalena would walk over with her chalice, she would fill it with blood, and she would drink it. And so this would go on and on for several weeks. And one of the most distressing aspects of these human sacrifices is that as she did more and more and more of them, Magdalena got it in her head that beating the sacrifice to death before consuming their blood was spoiling the blood in some way. And so what she began doing was she would have the other villagers beat the sacrifice into submission, and then she would have the sacrifice strung up to one of the pikes while they were still alive, and then she would carve their heart out while they were alive, and then she would drink their blood. So in May of 1963, when Sebastian, the 14-year-old boy, when he poked his head around and looked into that cave, he watched one of these sacrifices having their heart cut out, and he didn't know what to make of it, and so he ran to the police. And then the next day, he and the police officer, Luis Martinez, they would go back to the cave, and Magdalena and her cult would spot them, capture them, and drag them both into the cave, and both of them would be ritualistically sacrificed. They would have their hearts cut out, and Magdalena would drink their blood. When the police and army arrived in La Yerba Buena, it was a ghost town because all of the villagers had been ordered up to the cave where they had barricaded themselves inside with weapons because Magdalena probably knew there was going to be a big police response because one of their officers has gone missing out here. They're bound to be found out. And And so when the police and the army reach the cave, there's this big shootout with all of the villagers. And during the shootout, the majority of the villagers are killed. Also, the Hernandez brothers, they're also killed in the shootout. And then after the shootout stops, the police and the army would go into this cave and they would discover the pikes, the bloody pikes that are in the back of the cave with bits of human remains all over the ground. And then they would leave the cave and they would search the town and they would find the remains of Luis and Sebastian outside a particular shack. And then inside the shack was Magdalena and her brother Eliezer. They were still alive. They were trying to hide from the authorities, and so they would be arrested. It's believed Magdalena sacrificed and drank the blood of at least 15 of the villagers over a 6-week period. However, the only remains to be positively identified were Luis Martinez and Sebastian Guerrero. Ultimately, Magdalena and her brother Eliezer were sentenced to 50 years in prison, and all of the surviving villagers who participated in these sacrifices or who participated in the shootout with police and the army, they were given 30 years in prison. Amazingly, none of the villagers ever testified against Magdalena or her brother, despite the fact they were almost certainly offered reduced sentences in exchange for their testimony. Clearly, they were more terrified of the Incan goddess than they were terrified of the prospect of 30 years in prison. Although the exact date of when this happened is not known, Magdalena would eventually die behind bars. Ever since he was a child, Mark Twitchell had always dreamed of becoming a big-time Hollywood filmmaker. But he knew the odds were stacked against him because he lived in Edmonton, Canada, which was not exactly known for being a movie-making hub. Nonetheless, after high school, he enrolled in an Edmonton art college, and in 2000, he graduated, earning his degree in radio and television art. But after college, despite utilizing his training to make several films, none of them generated any buzz beyond his friends and family, and so it seemed like his filmmaking career was turning into a bit of a dud. However, in 2007, Mark had a bit of an unintentional breakthrough. He had been a longtime Star Wars fanatic, and that year, he decided, purely as a passion project, he was going to write a script for a prequel to the Star Wars franchise. When he finished it and shared the script with some of his colleagues, they were so impressed with his writing, they said, "Mark, you need to produce this into a movie. This is incredible." And so Mark, who was totally amazed at this unbelievable feedback he was getting, decided, you know what the heck, I will produce this movie. And so he began sending his script out to different actors and actresses to see if they might be interested in playing a role. And amazingly, one of the original Star Wars actors, Jeremy Bulloch, who played Boba Fett, he read the script and he was so impressed by it that he agreed to play a role in Mark's film. And so this passion project had quickly turned into Mark's biggest success yet. When the movie was finished, it did well, but it didn't propel Mark into Hollywood stardom. However, it did put him on the map as a bona fide filmmaker, and it showed him that if he just focused on making films about subjects he was already very passionate about, those films would be much more likely to succeed. And so in 2008, so roughly a year after creating the Star Wars fan fiction film, Mark decided to embark on another film project around another passion of his, Dexter. Dexter was a very popular TV show about a fictional serial killer whose name was Dexter, and the way Dexter would kill his victims is he would lure them into these small rooms, which he called kill rooms, and inside of them, basically every surface, the ceiling, the walls, the floor, were all covered in plastic sheeting to catch any of the blood, and then he would kill his victims, usually with a knife, and then afterwards he would dismember them and bag up their body, and he would roll up all this plastic, kind of collecting all the evidence, and then he would dump the plastic and the body into the ocean. Mark was obsessed with the show, and so it inspired him to make his next movie be about a killer too. Except instead of it being fiction like Dexter, he wanted his movie to be at least based on real events. And it just so happened, at the time he was thinking about doing this movie, there was this uncaught murderer terrorizing Edmonton, and so Mark decided the Edmonton killer would be his star. Mark would spend the next several weeks obsessively researching researching the Edmonton killer and his victims and establishing a clear timeline of what had happened with this case. And then after he felt like he had compiled every piece of information he possibly could, he used that research to concoct a 42-page first draft of his script. And as soon as he was done with that first draft, it somehow got leaked. And when it got leaked, the contents of this script were so shocking and so controversial that the script wound up in the hands of the Edmonton police. And when they read the script, they immediately recognized they had a big problem. They reached out to Mark and they told him under no circumstances can you turn this script into a movie, and then the police basically wiped this script off the face of the earth. Today, if you go looking for Mark's script online, you'll basically only find heavily censored versions of it. But recently, I got my hands on an uncensored version of this 42-page script. Now, I'm not going to literally read you this script. However, what I'm going to do is use the script's information to tell you Mark's highly controversial Edmonton killer story. As you listen, remember this story is based on actual events, and so the victims' names and the information about them is real. Okay, here we go. In early October 2008, a soft-spoken 26-year-old casino security guard named Giles Tetreault was living alone in Edmonton. Giles's life had recently been turned upside down because a few months earlier, his wife had told him that she just didn't love him anymore and that she was going to leave him. Giles was still very much in love with his wife, and so this was a totally heartbreaking experience for him. After she left, Giles tried to stay busy and keep his mind occupied, but it rarely worked. Oftentimes, he felt crushingly lonely and sad. But on Friday, October 3rd, when Giles came home from work that afternoon, he suddenly felt like, you know what, I gotta get my life together and I'm gonna start by finding myself a new romantic partner. And so he went on a dating site and he made himself a profile and he began scrolling through all of the women's profiles that lived roughly in his area. And at first, no one really appealed to him, but then he stopped on this one woman's profile. She was this young, blonde, beautiful woman named Sheena, and she lived right in Edmonton. And so Giles thought, what the heck, I'll send her a message. And so he did, just introducing himself and asking to talk further. And she responded just a couple of minutes later. And then over the next couple of hours, the two exchanged dozens of messages, getting to know each other. And then finally, Sheena just says to Giles, hey, you know, we live so close together. Why don't we get together tonight and go grab dinner and watch a movie together? And Giles is thrilled and he says, yeah, I'll come pick you up. What's your address? And Sheena would tell him, you know what, I don't feel comfortable sharing my address over this dating website. And so instead, she sent Giles this strange customized set of directions that didn't give the actual address of her house. Instead, it basically gave Giles a set of known landmarks in Edmonton that he could follow until he finally arrived at her residence. And she also told him that when he arrived, instead of just coming up to her house, there would be a detached garage and the door would be open and he would go through the garage, out the door into her backyard, and then he would go up the back steps to the back door of her house and she would meet him there. Now, Giles did think this was a little bit strange, but at the same time, he's thinking, you know, I am basically a complete stranger to her. We just met today on the internet, and so I really can't blame her for taking some extra safety precautions with me. And so he told Sheena he had no issues using her special directions, and then he said he'd be over soon. And so Giles hopped in the shower, he freshened up, he got dressed, he hopped in his truck, and then he began driving to Sheena's house. After about 15 minutes of following these directions, he reached the end of them, and they placed him in this alleyway in a suburban neighborhood. And where he stopped, he looked off to his right, and he saw there was this 2-car garage, and he knew it was Sheena's garage because one of the doors was open like she said it would be, although the door was not open all the way. It was open enough to where he would have to duck to get into the garage, but either way, he knew it was her garage. And so he turns off his truck, and he gets out, and he tries to look up at Sheena's house behind the garage to see if maybe he can see her looking out the back door, but the detached garage that was right up against the street was kind of blocking his view, and so he thought, okay, whatever, I'll just go in and make my way up to the back steps. And so he walks over to this 2-car garage, and he goes to the open side, he ducks down, and he goes underneath, and he stands up inside of the garage. Now, it was dark inside of the garage, there was no light on, but there was enough light spilling in from the opening of the garage door that he could see there was really nothing in the garage. However, virtually every surface, the walls, the ceiling, the floor, was covered in plastic sheeting. Now, he had no idea what this plastic sheeting was for, and he really didn't care. He just kept walking across the garage towards the door that would lead into Sheena's backyard. And when he reached that door, he reached down to the door handle and he was about to turn it when he felt a blinding pain in the back of his neck. He whipped around, and even though it was dark inside of this garage, he could clearly see this huge man in a black and gold hockey mask standing right in front of him holding a stun baton. Giles tries to run past him to try to get out of the garage, but the man grabs him and then takes his stun baton and drives it into Giles' stomach, and he pulls the trigger. And immediately Giles feels this coursing pain in his torso and he falls to the ground, and then this man in the mask releases the trigger and Giles tries to scramble up to his feet to try to run out of the garage. But as soon as Giles turns around, he stops where he is because he sees this huge guy in the mask is standing between him and this open garage door, and he's now holding a gun in his hand and he's aiming it right at Giles. And so Giles freezes. He has no idea what's going on, and this man who's got this mask on barks at Giles to get on the ground and put your face on the ground. And so Giles at this point is thinking, I'm going to get killed in here. I have nothing I can do. I'm completely defenseless here. And so he just does what he's told, and he lies down on the plastic sheeting and he's totally terrified. And this man walks over and he puts a piece of duct tape over Giles's eyes. And so as he's laying there blind and terrified, Giles becomes very emotional. He suddenly longs for his ex-wife and for his family and his friends. He wishes he could see them just one more time, and he knows he's not going to. Then, as he's laying there, he's coming to the stark realization that he didn't tell anyone where he was going. And so if this masked maniac does kill him, who's going to find his body? Will his family and friends ever know what happened to him? So as he's laying there thinking of these horrible thoughts, he hears his attacker, who's several feet behind him, start fiddling with what sounds like chains or handcuffs. And Giles thinks to himself, if I get chained up in here, I really am done. And so he has this sudden surge of adrenaline where he thinks to himself, I'm going to get killed in here. I know it. I'm going to get killed. But if I'm going to die, I'm going to die on my terms. And so Giles takes a deep breath and then jumps to his feet, rips the tape off of his eyes. He turns around and he faces his attacker and he says, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to go out this way. And the attacker is totally surprised, but he just begins to raise his gun at Giles to shoot him. And Giles lunges forward and he grabs the barrel of the gun and he pushes it away from him. And as soon as he does that, Giles realizes something. The gun is made of plastic. It's fake. And so Giles is suddenly so confident, he grabs the arms of his attacker and he tries to kick the guy in the legs, but the attacker is so much bigger and stronger than Giles that he just headbutts Giles. Giles goes flying to the ground and his attacker jumps on top of him and begins punching him and slamming his skull into the ground. But Giles is so high on adrenaline, he can't feel any of the blows. All he's trying to do this whole time as he's getting pummeled is just find a way to stand up and run out of this garage. Just get out, escape. And amazingly, against all odds, he does manage in between blows to wriggle his way out of the attacker's grasp. But as he begins to run towards that opening in the garage door, the attacker grabs him by the jacket. And so Giles twists himself and he actually comes out of the jacket. And then he throws himself onto the ground and he rolls out of the garage. And as soon as he is free, he suddenly can't stand up. The stun baton, he didn't feel it before, but it had sapped all of his strength. But the adrenaline had kind of overridden that feeling. But here he is outside and he suddenly can't stand up. And so he's trying to stand up, and then the attacker, who's still inside, dives down, reaches out from underneath the garage and grabs Giles by the ankle and begins trying to pull him back into the garage. And so Giles is kicking and screaming and punching, and he finally breaks free. And then he has another surge of adrenaline and he stands up and just begins running down the alleyway. Doesn't even go to his car. He just starts running towards, hopefully, civilization. And he makes it a couple of houses before he collapses to the ground in this very busy walking trail. And so he's landed right in this intersection where he's hoping someone's going to be. He turns back and looks down the alleyway and he sees his attacker, who's now on the road. He's got the mask still on his face and he's charging up the road. Giles can't even get up. He's so tired, but Giles looks to his side and he sees there's this random couple walking down the walking path. They see Giles on the ground around, who's calling out for help, and they run over to him, and they get right in front of Giles, and Giles immediately points at the attacker coming down the alleyway and says, "He's trying to kill me." And the attacker, amazingly, just jogs right up to Giles, right up to the couple. He does not take his mask off, and he acts like he's friends with Giles and says, "Oh, come on, Frank, you're making a big deal out of it. It's a game. Come back to the garage. I'll meet you there." And then the attacker just turns around and walks back down the alleyway, back towards his garage. And so Giles turns and looks up at the couple, who are totally freaked out by this whole situation. They don't know if this is some weird setup that they're going to get robbed or something. They don't know if this is a hoax. And so they say, "Hey, you're on your own, pal." And they turn and they leave. And so Giles is left in the middle of this intersection. The only people that could have helped him are now gone. And so he rolls over and just looks down the alleyway in the direction of the garage. And he can actually see his attacker pacing back and forth inside of the garage because that door is partially open. And so Giles doesn't know what to do. He has to get to his truck to get out of here. And so he just sits there for a couple of seconds, just watching the attacker, making sure he's staying inside of the garage. And then finally, he just took a deep breath. He pulled himself up and he stumbled down the alleyway. He got in his truck, fired it up, and he peeled out of there. When Giles got home, he was obviously traumatized from this horrible thing that had just happened to him, but he also felt embarrassed and kind of ashamed that he had clearly just gotten catfished by the psycho in the garage. Obviously, Sheena, the woman he supposedly was talking to, was not real. It was that guy in the garage that had attacked him, but he didn't really understand why it had happened. He had no idea why anyone would target him, and so the whole situation was just such a mess. He decided, you know what, I'm not going to tell anyone. He didn't report it to the police. He didn't tell his friends. He didn't tell his family. He just decided he was going to move on and forget about it. A week later, on October 8th, another Edmonton man, 38-year-old Johnny Altinger, was perusing the dating website that Giles had been using. Johnny made a living doing quality control for an oil and gas company, but he hated that job. He much preferred to spend his time tinkering with his computers or his prized motorcycle. Johnny had lots of very close friends, but romance was always something that had eluded him. So that afternoon, Johnny, like Giles, was on this dating website to potentially find a romantic partner. And so as he was scrolling through all of these different women's profiles that lived roughly in his area, he wasn't interested in any of them until he stopped on this one profile of this beautiful young blonde woman named Jen, who lived right in Edmonton. And so Johnny was interested. He sent her a message, and very quickly she wrote back, and before long the two are chumming it up, and then eventually they actually agree to get together that night for dinner and a movie. But when Johnny asked Jen for her address, she would tell him that she's a paranoid person and she doesn't want to give him her actual address over this website. And so instead, she gave him a set of very strange directions that relied on local landmarks in Edmonton to guide him into her residence. And she would tell Johnny, when you get here, go through the garage, the door will be open, go out the back door, go into the backyard, make your way up to the back of the house, and I will meet you at the back door. And so Johnny definitely thought these directions were very strange, but he was really eager to meet up with Jen, and so he really didn't care. And so he told Jen it was no big deal, he'd happily follow her directions, and then he hopped in the shower and he got himself together, and then before he left to go to Jen's house, he forwarded Jen's email that included her very strange directions. He sent those directions to one of his very close friends, and he kind of jokingly included a message that was like, "Hey, if I go missing tonight, this is where I'm going." And then Johnny hopped in his car and he left. The directions brought Johnny to the same garage in the same alleyway that Giles had been to a week earlier. And when Johnny came to a stop in front of Jen's two-car garage with one of the doors partially open, he saw there were lights still on inside of the garage, and he saw someone walking around inside. And so Johnny looked at his watch and he realized he was maybe 15 or 20 minutes too early, and so he parks his car and he's thinking, okay, you know, Jen might be inside of this garage and I'm early, but maybe I'll just walk over and say hi to her. I'm sure she wouldn't mind. And so Johnny turns off his car, he gets out, and he starts walking over to this half-open garage door, and as he gets closer and closer, the lights in the garage go off. And so Johnny stops and he's thinking, why are the lights off? Did she hear me? Does she not want me to come in? You know, what's going on? But he's thinking, okay, well, I should definitely go over and say something. And so he walks over to this open garage door and he bends down and he looks inside and it's totally dark. And he just says, hello? And there's a pause, and then the lights come on, and Johnny suddenly sees this garage that's basically devoid of anything, minus a table off to the side, and every surface is covered in plastic sheeting. The floors, the walls, the ceiling, everything. And in the back of the garage is not Jen. Instead, it's this man he doesn't recognize. And so Johnny's looking at this man, and this man is looking over at Johnny, and finally the man speaks and says, "Hi, I'm Harry. I'm a designer. I rent this garage out from Jen. And I just talked to Jen, and you're meeting up with her tonight, right? You're meeting up with Jen? Yeah. She's running late. So I think she'll be back in about maybe 20 minutes. So can you come back in 20 minutes? Come right back here, come to the garage, and I'll bring you up to the house because I know you're meeting her up at the house. So 20 minutes. And so Johnny doesn't really know what to make of this. He figures, okay, I don't really know what Jen's arrangement is with this designer in this plastic covered garage, but whatever. And so Johnny says, okay, no problem. I'll come back in 20 minutes. And so Johnny turns around and he walks back to his car and he leaves and drives around for about 20 minutes. And then he comes back to the garage. And as soon as he parks, he notices right away the light in the garage is now off. So presumably Harry has actually left. And so he will not be available to walk Johnny up to the house to meet Jen. But Johnny was thinking, I don't really want to interact with Harry. He seems like a strange guy anyways. And so he counts this as a win. And so Johnny parks his car, he hops out, he walks over to the garage, he bends down and goes inside of the garage. He stands up and he walks across the plastic lined floor to the door that's going to lead out into Jen's backyard. But before he reaches that door, something smashes into the back of his head. And immediately Johnny is horribly dazed and he instinctively throws his hands up to protect his head, and he begins spinning around trying to figure out who or what had just hit him. And as soon as he turns around, he sees in the shadows is the figure of none other than the man he saw before, Harry. And Harry is holding a big metal pipe. And immediately when Johnny sees him, he begins screaming, "Police, police, police!" And Harry just winds up and wails on Johnny with this metal pipe. And Johnny's trying to turn around and get away from Harry, but Harry just keeps moving around him and beating him with this pipe until finally Johnny collapses on the ground, but he's not unconscious. And so Johnny is kind of shielding his head and he's looking up at Harry, who's now just standing over him. He's ceased his initial barrage. And Johnny begins pleading with Harry, I'll give you money. I'll give you anything. Just please let me go. And so Harry smiles and he says, "You promise you won't tell anyone if I let you go?" But before Johnny could answer this, Harry winds up with his pipe and he brings it crashing down on Johnny's face. But amazingly, this does not knock Johnny unconscious. Instead, Johnny grabs the pipe after it hits him in the head and he holds onto it to prevent Harry from hitting him again. And so at this point, Harry is frustrated that Johnny is still putting up this huge fight. And so with one hand holding onto this pipe that Johnny has the other end of, Harry reaches down with his other hand and he unsheaths a hunting knife. And he holds the blade right in front of Johnny's face. And as soon as Johnny sees this knife, his eyes go wide and he lets go of the pipe and he begins to plead for his life. But Harry just smiles and continues to show him the blade. And then at some point he grabs Johnny's shoulder, he pulls the knife back and he plunges it into Johnny's stomach. Johnny howls out in pain and he curls over and he begins screaming for the police, screaming for someone to help him. And then finally Harry pulls the knife out of his stomach and then plunges it into the side of Johnny's neck. And then Harry lets go of the knife and he stands up and he just watches Johnny as he bleeds out onto the plastic lining. As Harry watched Johnny die, he had this pang of regret. He thought to himself, why didn't I play more mind games with him before I killed him? I'll do that with the next one. After Johnny died, Harry would dismember and bag up Johnny's body, and then he would roll up all of the plastic from the walls and the ceiling. He'd gather that all up, and then a couple of days later, he would dump both Johnny's body parts and all of the plastic containing all of the evidence down a nearby sewer drain. At this point in the story, Mark's script just kind of comes to an abrupt end. We don't know what Harry did after getting rid of Johnny's body and the evidence because Mark just didn't write it. It was like he didn't finish the script. And there's a reason for that, and it's the same reason the police stepped in and stopped Mark from making this script into a movie. At the time they read his script, the police had already figured out who owned the garage where Giles and Johnny were attacked. Johnny's friend, the one who Johnny had forwarded Jen's email that had those strange directions, well, that friend gave those directions to the police once Johnny had been reported missing. And so the police followed these strange directions to this garage, and they discovered it was not owned by some young, beautiful blonde named Jen or Sheena. It was not owned by some designer named Harry. It was owned by a young, up-and-coming filmmaker named Mark Twitchell. But to this point, Mark had been extremely cooperative with police and allowed them to search it, and they found nothing. And he explained to them he was not remotely the only person with access to this garage, not by a long shot. But when police searched Mark's laptop, they found a hidden document, and this document was his 42-page script. And when they read it, they saw there was a huge issue. Giles, the first victim of the Edmonton killer, had eventually gotten over his embarrassment and shame, and he went to the Edmonton police and he told them in detail what happened to him inside of that garage. But Giles was so scared he had not told anybody else what had happened. The only people who knew were himself and the Edmonton police. Yet somehow, in Mark's script, the account of what happened to Giles was exactly correct. Every little detail of what happened to Giles was encompassed inside of this script. And the reason Mark had this information is because Mark was in the garage when Giles got attacked. Because Mark was the Edmonton killer. Mark had been so desperate to make his killer in his new movie as good as Dexter in the TV show that Mark decided he needed to literally become Dexter in real life. He needed to know exactly what it felt like to lure an unsuspecting victim into a kill room and murder them so that he'd be able to more accurately write about it in his script. He believed this would put his movie over the top. It would be the most authentic killer movie ever, and it would be his ticket to Hollywood. And so after Mark used a fake dating profile to trap and then attack Giles, after that experience, he wrote about it, and that became his script. And then when he did the same thing to Johnny and then actually successfully killed and disposed of him, he sat down and wrote about that experience too and tacked it onto the end of the Giles attack. He was literally living his movie and writing the script in real time. The title that Mark gave his script was SK Confessions, which stood for Serial Killer Confessions. And that's exactly what the script was. It was a real confession. And based on the way his script just kind of abruptly ends without any sort of conclusion, it seems fairly obvious that Mark was planning to kill more people and then incorporate those experiences into this script. Ultimately, though, the script that was found by police was used to convict Mark of murder, and he is currently serving life in prison. If you hop in a boat just off the coast of Aberdeen, Scotland, and you cruise eastward, after about 7 hours, depending on your speed and the weather, you would come across this massive man-made structure jutting up out of the ocean. It looks like a cross between a construction site and a corporate office building sitting on top of 100-foot-tall metal stilts. It's called Magellan, and it is an offshore oil rig, and it will remain in place until all the oil has been sucked up in that area. The people who work, often for weeks or months at a time, on rigs like Magellan are known as roughnecks, and they have one of, if not the most dangerous job in the world. All exterior surfaces on these offshore rigs are always slick, either with water or oil, and so there is a constant risk of falling, sometimes hundreds of feet. If you're up on a higher platform, you could fall to a lower platform, which could be fatal, or you could fall clean off the rig all the way to the ocean 100 plus feet below. If you add in some bad windy weather, the risk of falling increases tenfold. Also, the crude oil that these roughnecks are drilling for is highly combustible, and so fires are a huge concern as well. And if that wasn't risky enough, there's also this phenomenon known as a blowout, where basically the oil well that the drill is actually drilling into will just explode. Now, all rigs have some sort of mitigating equipment to try to save themselves in case this occurs, but in reality, if it happens and you are unfortunately near the drill when it happens, you are likely to be killed or maimed. While the downsides of working on an oil rig are fairly obvious, the upsides are too. Namely, your pay is fantastic. In 2000, a 41-year-old father of two named Gordon Moffat was a roughneck working on the Magellan. His primary job was to perform maintenance on the drill. Now, these offshore rigs work great most of the time, but they do have a habit of breaking down fairly often. And for a drilling company, anytime they are not sucking out crude oil, they're losing money. And so it was just a known thing when you worked on one of these rigs that as soon as there is an issue that causes the drill to stop working, it must be fixed immediately, whether it's day, night, horrible weather, good weather, it didn't matter. It had to be fixed right away. And so on the night of October 9th that year, Gordon had just gotten back to his quarters to end the day when he got a call on his radio that he was actually needed to come back out to fix a problem that had stopped the drill. Now, Gordon was a seasoned roughneck and he had grown quite accustomed to these late night calls to go out and fix things. And so he wasn't annoyed. He just put his stuff back on, turned around, and he headed out the door. When Gordon got to the main deck, which is this wide open metal platform right in the middle of the rig where the drill actually passes down through it on its way to the ocean, when he got to the main deck, he was met by some of his coworkers who told him where he would need to go. The cabling that needed fixing was located right below the main deck. However, it was not accessible from the main deck. In order for Gordon to get to it, he would need to go down to the next lowest platform from the main deck. Basically, he would need to hop in an elevator and go down one floor. And from this lower deck, the crew on the main deck would lower down a harness attached to a long wire. They would feed it down through this hole in the main deck platform called a mouse hole. It was about 10 inches across, and they would feed it down, and he would grab the harness, he would put it on, and then he would signal up to the main deck crew who could literally see him through this mouse hole. They would turn around and they would signal somebody called the hoist operator, and they were located above the main deck, slightly back. They couldn't actually see Gordon, so they're relying on communications with the people on the main deck. And the hoist operator would start their winch, and a winch basically reels in the wire that was connected to the harness that was on Gordon. And so once the hoist operator was informed, he'd turn on the winch, and then Gordon would be raised up until he could access these cables, and then he'd do his maintenance and be lowered back down, and that would be it. Now, Gordon and the crew had done maintenance using this winch system many times before, so this was a very routine fix. So Gordon made his way from the main deck down to the slightly lower deck, and he looked up at the mouse hole, and he watched as the main deck crew members lowered the harness with the wire attached to it down through the mouse hole. And so Gordon grabbed the harness, he put it around his waist, and he secured it. And after he was sure it was on correctly, he signaled up to the crew on the main deck that he was ready to start, and they in turn turned around. They flagged the hoist operator who started the winch. And so very slowly, Gordon was lifted off the platform he was standing on, and he was brought up after several minutes, all the way up about 10 feet to access these cables. And as soon as he was parallel with them, he waved to the main deck crew, who were not far from him at this point, and he said, "I'm good." And so they turned around, they told the hoist operator, who stopped the winch. And so Gordon got his tools out and he began working on these cables, and the whole time he's trying to stay in one place because the wind is whipping through and he's kind of dangling and swinging around. And then eventually he finishes the repair, the cables are good, and so he signals the crew on the main deck through the mouse hole that he was good to go. "You can lower me back down now." And so the main deck crew, they turn, they wave to the hoist operator to go ahead and lower Gordon, and the hoist operator, he gives the thumbs up and he starts the winch. However, the hoist operator accidentally forgot to switch the direction of the winch. And so when he started it again, instead of the winch spooling the wire out and lowering Gordon, it continued to reel the wire in, pulling Gordon upward. Now, the winch did not move very quickly, and so it wasn't like Gordon is rocketing up towards the mouse hole. However, this problem was immediately recognized by Gordon and the main deck crew, and so they're frustrated. They're yelling up at the hoist operator saying, "Stop, stop, stop, reverse the winch." They're all waving and flagging this guy down. But the hoist operator, after he had hit start on the winch, had just kind of turned around, because this is a routine thing they've done a million times before. And so he's not looking at the crew on the main deck. So he has no idea what's going on. And it was so windy and loud that night on board the rig that he couldn't hear their cries. And so the winch just continued to reel in the wire, slowly raising Gordon closer and closer to the mouse hole. Now, Gordon could not get out of his harness unless he was on the platform below. So there was no way to escape the situation he was in. And so Gordon, after a few seconds of this not stopping and him continuing upward, he starts screaming. He's not annoyed anymore. He's terrified. And so is the crew on the main deck. They are now frantically screaming at the hoist operator to stop the winch, but nothing is working. And so one of the main deck crew members, sensing that they need to do something different desperate to get this guy's attention, he runs away from where the mouse hole is to this nearby phone, and this phone is connected up to the hoist operator station, and he picks it up and it starts dialing. Up in the hoist operator station, he's still not paying attention when the phone rings. He grabs the phone, puts it to his ear, and immediately he's hit with screams to stop the winch. And so the hoist operator, totally confused, whips around and hits stop on the winch. But it was too late. Just a few moments earlier, Gordon had finally been pulled all the way up right to the entrance of the underside of this mouse hole. And as he reached this hole, he tried to position himself in a vertical position so that maybe he could slip his upper body into the hole and he could just kind of slide through the hole. He'd still be hurt by it, but it would limit the damage. However, because of his harness being on his waist right in front of him, he couldn't get himself into a vertical position. He could only lay back in a horizontal one. And so when he reached the underside of the main deck and he's looking right at this mouse hole, he just put his arms and his legs out and tried to push himself back as if he could fight the winch and keep himself from going into this hole. But there was nothing he could do. And so his pelvis first was pulled into the 10-inch hole. And as his body begins to literally break in half, he's screaming out in pain. And then by the time the hoist operator had hit stop, Gordon was already deceased, and only a section of his torso actually made it up through the hole. Gordon's company was found guilty of being blatantly delinquent on many safety protocols, and so they were fined £60,000, and then they paid an undisclosed amount to Gordon's family. Before we get into our next story, I want to talk about today's sponsor, Current. Current is the future of money management. It's done entirely on your phone and with a debit card. Here's mine. But what they announced just last month is why they're so popular right now. They launched a program just called Interest, which is literally one of the very best savings options on the market right now. It comes with a whopping 4% APY with no special requirements, which in layman's terms means it will generate you 60 times the American national average. And at a time in America where inflation is as high as it's been in 40 years, now is a great time to jump on this offer. It's like you're signing up for free money. And if that's not incentive enough, Current and I are literally giving away free money, $10,000 to you all, so you can start to earn that sweet, sweet 4% APY. All you gotta do is sign up for Current using my code BALLENINTEREST, and then you could be one of 20 people who get $500 from this promotion. Okay, back to the stories. In October of 1994, a middle-aged man named Ivan, who lived in Estonia, which is a country in Northern Europe, was walking in this forest looking for firewood. This forest butted up against the town he lived in, which was called Timiku, and so as a result of his proximity to it, he had spent a lot of time in these woods over the years. But in general, his exposure to this forest was just on the fringes. He would only look for firewood along the perimeter of the woods. But for whatever reason, that day he was just really having a hard time finding good firewood, and so at some point he decided to just walk deeper into the woods to see if he would have luck in there. And so he turns and starts walking into the forest, and very quickly, when the town has kind of disappeared from view behind him, he looked around and kind of liked being in the woods. He didn't go for walks in the woods, and suddenly he was on this nice nature walk. And so he decided, you know what, I can wait on the firewood. I'll just walk in the forest for a little while longer and enjoy myself and kind of meditate. So he just continued walking deeper and deeper into the woods, and after walking for nearly an hour, just kind of mindlessly walking about, he sees up ahead there is very clearly a clearing, and then before the clearing is what looks like a chain link fence. Now, he's never been this deep into the woods before, so he has no idea what this is, but he's obviously curious, and so he decides he'll go see what it is. And so he continues walking closer and closer to what obviously is a chain link fence, and as he's getting closer to it, the trees around him are beginning to thin out, and suddenly, before he even reaches the fence, he gets a very clear view of what's on the other side. And it's this huge multi-story building that almost looks like a factory or some sort of government facility, and it's sitting maybe a couple hundred feet away from the fence, right in the middle of this property, and there's really nothing around it. It's just this cleared out big open area with this big building right in the middle, and there's a fence all the way around it. And so Ivan is totally intrigued by this, and so he walks right up to the fence, he grabs onto it, and he tries to look and figure out what this building is, but there's no clear signage on it and there's no people anywhere. It's completely barren. There's nothing but this building. And then he notices there's obviously graffiti on the sides of this building, and the doors and windows appeared to be boarded up. And so this building, whatever it is clearly abandoned. And the first thought that goes through Ivan's head is scrap metal. Times were tough for Ivan and his family, and so he and his two brothers, they all lived together, they would go out and they would steal scrap metal and sell it for a little bit of extra cash to make ends meet and provide for their big family. And so he's looking at this big building thinking, you know, if I can get in there, I guarantee you there is some metal that I can steal and I can sell. And so Ivan stayed at this fence just kind of staring at this building for a little while longer and continued to look around to make sure there weren't any people that he hadn't seen before. And after feeling satisfied that this really was a totally abandoned building, he turned around and began hustling back towards town. And when he finally made it to town, making sure to grab some firewood along the way, he rounded up his two brothers and he told them about this find in the forest. And they all very excitedly agreed that that night they would go right back out there and they would go inside the building and see what they could find. And so around 9 p.m. that night, the brothers met up and they had flashlights and a set of bolt cutters, and they headed into the nearby forest and they marched their way all the way up to this fence that Ivan had found earlier in the day. And they lifted their flashlights up and they scanned through the fence all over the property. And when they didn't see anyone, they put their flashlights down and one by one they climbed up and over this fence. And then once they were all on the other side, they began making their way up to this huge building sitting in the middle of the property. And when they got up to this building, they confirmed it definitely looked like it was abandoned, except all of the doors and windows were sealed in such a way that even with bolt cutters, there was just no way to pry them open. They were not going to get inside this building. And so after a little while of still trying to kind of smash their way into this building, the brothers all linked up and they decided, you know what, we're not getting in, and the longer we stay here, the better the chances are that we get caught. And so let's just head back. And so feeling totally dejected, they turn and they start walking back towards the fence they hopped in on. And as they're walking along, they're kind of shining their lights left and right and looking around. And off to the far right side of the property, there is this small shack that they had not noticed on their way in. And so the brothers look at each other and they're like, hey, you know, we're already on this side of the fence. We might as well go check it out and see what's inside of it. Maybe there's scrap metal in there. And so the brothers turn and start making their way over to this shed. And when they get there, they discover it's only secured with a simple padlock on a wooden door. And so they get their bolt cutters, they pop off the lock, they open up the door, and there's initially nothing inside. At least that's what they think. But they move something on the ground and it reveals this stairwell that leads into this underground bunker. And now it's the middle of the night on this abandoned property they've snuck into. And so there's some apprehension, but they shine their lights down the steps and they didn't see any immediate hazards. And they're thinking, you know what, this is an adventure. Let's go down and see what's down there. And so they all went down the steps. And when they got down to the bottom, they turned the corner and they shined their light to see what's down here. And what was down there was this huge cellar that was full of scrap metal. There was metal all over the ground, and then there were also these shelves that went as far back as their lights could shine, and on the lower shelves there were these weird square metal boxes that almost looked like briefcases, and then above those on the top shelf were 55-gallon aluminum drums. And in the brothers' experience, these drums were very, very valuable, except they needed to make sure they weren't full of some liquid, because if they're full, they weigh like 500 pounds, and there's no way they'd be able to get them out, and then trying to open them up and spill whatever's inside of them is hazardous for a lot of reasons. And so they walked over to the first 55-gallon drum they saw, and they pushed it to see if it was empty. And the drum immediately rocked back and forth, echoing inside, indicating that it was empty. This was a huge, huge win. And so the brothers are totally amazed. They grab this first drum, they pull it off the shelf, and they wheel it over to the base of the steps. And then they go back to get another drum off the shelf, and they reach up, they grab another empty drum, and as they're pulling it off, it dislodges another 55-gallon drum that was nearby that was full of some liquid. So it weighed 500 pounds, and it comes crashing off the shelf and it lands on Ivan's leg, pinning him to the ground. And immediately the two other brothers pulled the drum off of Ivan, but it was obvious there had been significant damage done to his leg. Ivan couldn't even stand up anymore. And so the brothers are looking around thinking, man, this is an amazing haul, but if Ivan can't even walk, I mean, it's going to be a nightmare trying to haul this metal back while also supporting Ivan. And so they decided they would leave now and they would wait for Ivan to heal up, and then they would come back and they would collect their amazing haul. And so the brothers, they reached down and they picked up whatever pieces of metal they could to just kind of stuff in their pockets. And then the two brothers supported Ivan and carried him up the stairs. And then they very slowly walked their way over to the fence. And then somehow the three of them got up and over the fence. And then very slowly they made their way all the way through the forest back to Tamiku. And when they got there, the two brothers helped Ivan get into his house and they put him in his bed. And then Ivan went to sleep. The next morning when Ivan got up, he was expecting to feel better, but in fact, his leg felt exponentially worse. And then over the course of the next 72 hours, Ivan still believed if he just gutted it out and he waited, his leg would get better, but it just got worse and worse and worse. And so 4 days after this leg injury, Ivan was in so much pain, he couldn't do anything. And so he finally decided he had to go to the hospital. And so when he gets to the hospital, the doctor asks Ivan, what happened to your leg? And Ivan would tell him that, I was in the woods and a tree fell on my leg, because he didn't want to admit to trying to steal scrap metal. And so the doctors, they accepted this. It seemed totally reasonable based on what his injury looked like. And so they admitted him to the hospital. They put him in his hospital room. And right away, the doctors and nurses began administering all the treatments and things they would do for a crush injury. But it seemed like nothing was working. Over the course of the next several days, Ivan complained endlessly of the pain in his leg getting worse and worse and worse, and the swelling was going up, and overall Ivan's health just continued to deteriorate over his stay in the hospital. And then a week after being admitted to the hospital, so roughly 10 or 11 days after he was hurt, the doctors walked into his room and he was dead. His kidneys had just abruptly failed, and the doctors and nurses had absolutely no idea why. And so they told the family, we don't know what happened to him. And so the family just had to collect Ivan's body, and then they had a funeral for him. But they're all thinking to themselves, how could this have happened? He hurt his leg and then his kidneys failed? It didn't make any sense. But before they could get any clarity on that, they were dealt another tragedy. The beloved family dog just kind of abruptly died. It was young, it was healthy, and so just like Ivan, it was like this totally unexpected death. And so once again, the family's asking, what's going on here? And then just a couple of days after that, Ivan's stepson came downstairs one morning complaining of feeling sick. And when his family looked at his hands, they were blistered and covered in boils and looked like he had just reached his hands into a fire or something. But he would tell his family, I didn't do that. I don't know what's going on with my hands. I don't know why I feel so sick. And so the family rushed the boy to the hospital, and naturally the doctors asked him, how did your hands get this way? What happened to you? And the boy would say, I don't know. But over the course of this initial discussion with doctors, the boy would tell them that over the last couple of days, he had been sifting through his stepfather, Ivan's possessions, and he had actually been using some of Ivan's tools from his toolbox. Now, the doctors were already aware of the strangeness around Ivan's death, and they were aware of the sudden passing of the family dog, and now they're seeing this boy who is showing up with these strange symptoms for no particular reason. And so the doctors knew something was off. And so on a hunch, they contacted the authorities and they told them what they thought. And then later that day, the authorities showed up at Ivan's family's house, and when they got out of the car, they were covered head to toe in white hazardous materials suits, and they told the family to evacuate the house for their safety. And then these people in suits got out these special wands and tools, and they marched into the family home, and immediately all their equipment led them to this one particular closet near the kitchen. And when they opened it up, in the closet was Ivan's toolbox, the same one the boy had been handling over the past couple of days. And when they opened that up, they found there were lots of normal tools you would expect inside of a toolbox, and they discovered one strange piece of scrap metal. It was the only piece of scrap metal that Ivan had grabbed off the floor of that cellar and tucked in his pocket before he and his brothers had left. And then after Ivan had passed away, his stepson had been going through his things and he had discovered this piece of scrap metal, and for whatever reason he had transferred it from the jacket to Ivan's toolbox. What Ivan and his family didn't know was that that piece of metal was extremely dangerous because it came not from some abandoned building on some abandoned property in the middle of the forest. It came from an abandoned nuclear waste storage facility. That is what Ivan and his brothers had snuck onto. But because Ivan and his brothers had hopped over that side fence, they didn't see any of the warning signs that are posted on the front of the front gates telling people to stay back. Inside that cellar that the brothers were in, those small metal briefcase looking things on the lower shelves were shields for radiation. Inside of each of them was radioactive metal. And when that full 55-gallon drum came crashing off the shelf and smashed into Ivan's leg, his leg was not the only thing it smashed into. It smashed into one of those metal briefcases and broke it open, sending the radioactive metal inside of it flying out, and it landed right next to Ivan on the ground. And so when the brothers scrambled to pick up whatever loose scrap metal there was on the ground, Ivan unfortunately grabbed one piece, and it was the radioactive one. By the time Ivan finally got back to his house, he was actually already dead. He just didn't know it yet. That piece of metal had been inside of his jacket pocket, and it had been pressed against his body long enough that he had been dealt a fatal dose of radiation. There was nothing anybody could have done, even if they knew what had happened to him. As for the dog, it used to sleep on Ivan's jacket, and it did so when this piece of scrap metal was inside of it, and so it too died of radiation poisoning. As for Ivan's stepson, the reason his hands had been so badly burned and why he had become so sick, that was just from his brief exchange of touching the piece of scrap metal and then putting it in Ivan's toolbox. That alone had done that much damage to him. When the doctors considered the strangeness of Ivan's death, the dog's death, and now this boy's symptoms, they did suspect radiation poisoning, and so that was how the authorities were able to get to their house and very quickly locate that toolbox. Amazingly, Ivan's stepson and the rest of Ivan's family, including his two brothers, would make full recoveries. However, several months after this event and after authorities had come in and said their house was clear of radiation, the grandmother would suddenly die totally unexpectedly. She was healthy, nothing was wrong with her, and so even though it was not officially cited as having been caused by radiation, many people believe it's from the exposure she had to this piece of scrap metal. In 2017, 71-year-old Bernard Gore was a retiree living in Tasmania, which is an island state of Australia. In January of that year, he and his wife of 50 years, Angela, decided to go visit their daughter who lived in Sydney, Australia. Now, they made this trip with some regularity, and they developed a sort of routine for every time they visited. They would land in Sydney, and then the first day they would spend it entirely with their daughter at her house. And then the next day, Angela would get up early, and she would head out into town and do some shopping on her own. And then sometime in the afternoon, Bernard would head out and he would meet up with her for lunch at a very popular spot. It was called the Westfield Center Mall, and they had an amazing food court. So on January 5th of that year, Bernard and Angela, they land in Sydney, and like they always did, they went straight to their daughter's house and they spent the day with her. And then early the next morning, Angela got up and she headed out to do her shopping. And before she left, she confirmed with her husband that they would meet up for lunch at Westfield Center Mall. Now, as it happened that day, Angela actually chose to do her shopping at Westfield Center Mall. And so she was there around lunchtime when she was supposed to meet Bernard. And so when she looked at her watch and she realized it was time to meet him, she just simply stepped out of the shop she was in and headed over to the food court. And when she got there, she found their meeting spot. It was in front of one of their favorite restaurants. And she sat down and then she scanned around looking for her husband. But inside of this busy food court, she couldn't see him. And so she looked at her watch again and she realized she was a couple of minutes early. And so she grabbed a menu and she began looking for what she was going to order while she waited for him to show up. But 15 minutes would go by and Bernard would not show up. And so now he was late. And so Angela, at this point, she pulls her phone out and she tries calling her husband, but he didn't answer. However, that was kind of common for Bernard, so not necessarily a red flag. Angela would continue to try calling her husband for the next several minutes, and each time he would not answer. And so eventually Angela just gets frustrated and she's thinking to herself, maybe he just got sidetracked and he's walking around the mall somewhere, because Bernard was known for being a big window shopper. And as soon as Angela thought that, she was like, that's got to be it. And it was so frustrating for her that he had just totally blown off their lunch date. And so she stands up, she abandons her table, she's totally annoyed, and she heads out into the main shopping area to go find her husband. And so she's walking along, looking in each of the windows, expecting to see her husband. And at the same time, she's looking over her shoulder back towards the food court to see if maybe Bernard had shown up. But after 30 minutes of wandering around kind of right near the food court and not seeing him anywhere, Angela thinks to herself, you know what? I bet he thought we were supposed to meet at our daughter's house first. And so he probably hasn't even left the house yet. I bet he's just there waiting for me. And so Angela, when she realizes this, she stops looking for him in the mall. She turns around and she begins walking towards the mall exit. But before she reaches the exit door, a terrifying thought crosses her mind. What if Bernard got confused and has no idea where he is right now? A recent unfortunate development for Bernard was that he was showing early signs of dementia. It hadn't fully taken a hold of him yet, but he was clearly starting to forget things that he shouldn't. And so as soon as Angela thought of this, she went from being annoyed with her husband to being very worried about her husband. And so she sped through those doors outside and speed walked all the way back to her daughter's house, which was not far from the mall. And the whole time she's walking, she's telling herself she's going to walk inside and she's going to see Bernard. He's going to be in the house. But when she got to the house and went inside and saw her daughter said, "No, Dad left about 2 hours ago to go meet you. I haven't seen or heard from him since." Now, of course, both of them were extremely worried for Bernard, but they decided to just stay calm, that the best thing they could do right now would just be to stay put, stay at their daughter's house and wait for Bernard to eventually come back, because the only other logical place he would go would be his daughter's house. And so they sat at the house, just kind of waiting, looking at the door, waiting for him to come in. But he didn't, and by 8 p.m., 6 hours after anybody had last seen Bernard, he still had not shown up. They couldn't get in touch with him, and so Angela called the police and reported him missing. Immediately, the police contacted the Westfield Center Mall security team and said, hey, we're looking for this guy, and they went right down to the food court where Bernard and Angela had said they were going to meet, and the mall security team walked all around, and they walked into all the nearby shops and kind of scanned the immediate vicinity near their meeting spot. But they reported back to police that there was no sign of Bernard. And they would also tell police that after reviewing their camera footage, and this mall had hundreds of cameras covering every angle, inside and out, everything is covered. They would tell police, after reviewing the footage, we didn't see Bernard enter or exit the mall at any point today. He was not here. And so the police, they take this information and they go back to Angela that night and they say, hey, look, we talked to the mall, and based on their security footage, they have no record of Bernard ever being in the mall. Do you have any idea where he could have gone? And Angela would say, no, the only places would have been the mall or maybe at our daughter's house. This is also when Angela explained to police that her husband had early signs of dementia, and so it was possible that he might have just gotten confused and he could be out on the street somewhere. But she assured the police that her husband, whenever this happened, whenever he got confused, he would just sit down and he would try to ask for help from anybody passing by, or he would just sit where he was and he would wait for his family to come find him. And so with this knowledge, the police went back out and they widened their search and they began looking in all the areas that were within walking distance of the Westfield Center Mall. At the same time, Angela and her daughter began trying to retrace Bernard's footsteps from the daughter's home in the direction of the Westfield Center Mall to see if maybe there was something obvious along the route that might have sidetracked him and kind of led him astray, and that maybe he'd be somewhere else in those directions. But as they were walking around, there really was nothing that stood out to them. And then eventually it just got too dark out and they had to just turn it in and go back to their house and hope that the next morning when they got up, the police would have found Bernard and that he was okay. But the next morning when they got up, the police had not found Bernard. There was no sign of him. There was no clues, nothing. And unfortunately, over the next several weeks, there was no sign of Bernard. Nobody knew what happened to him. On January 27th, so 3 weeks after Bernard had gone missing, a maintenance worker at the Westfield Center Mall was walking down the staff-only passageway. It was basically like this tunnel with no windows, all concrete. They kind of looped around the outside of the mall to help workers get to and from certain locations in the building. He's walking down this passageway when he looks down this one hallway that was very rarely used, and he sees at the end of it, barely lit up from the lights inside, there looks to be some equipment kind of propped up against the wall. And he's thinking to himself, there's no reason someone would leave their equipment at the end of this very rarely used hallway. It didn't make any sense. And so he decided to walk down and see whose equipment it was. And so he's making his way down, and he's getting closer and closer, and he still can't quite figure out what it is. The lighting's not great, but when he gets close enough to see what it is, he stops where he is, he turns around, and he runs back down the hallway. He finds the nearest exit, he goes outside, and he calls the police. Back on January 6th, on the day that Bernard and Angela were supposed to meet up for lunch, Bernard did leave his daughter's house, and he walked straight to the mall, and he got there. He arrived at the Westfield Center Mall and was picked up on camera walking into their food court. But the staff at the mall who reviewed the footage for police, they only looked at a handful of cameras. There's hundreds of cameras. They only looked at a couple, and so they missed this crucial footage of Bernard. And what the footage would have shown them was Bernard making his way into the food court ahead of Angela. Angela's nowhere to be found. And Bernard, instead of sitting down at their meeting spot in front of this restaurant, Bernard suddenly looks like he's confused, and he turns and he walks to this emergency exit door. He presses it in, he steps inside, and the door shuts behind him. Now, the Westfield Center Mall is not your average mall. It is massive. There are 6 floors to it, nearly 300 shops and restaurants. But what truly makes it massive is something that the public doesn't usually see. And that is behind staff-only doors and emergency exit doors like the one Bernard had just gone through are nearly 8 miles of windowless concrete, narrow stairwells and tunnels that loop all around the outside of the building. And once Bernard had gone through that emergency exit door and that door had shut and locked behind him, the only way for him to return to the food court and meet his wife would be if he completely exited the mall and looped all the way back around. But in order to exit the mall from where he just entered, he would need to go to a very specific exterior fire exit door that was several floors below him, and to get to it required following this very confusing signage on the walls. And so if you did it correctly, you would basically go down the hallway, find this particular stairwell, you'd go down a couple of levels, and then at some point, without really any signage, you would get to the appropriate floor, and you'd go down the hallway into this maze of more hallways, and then finally you'd reach this kind of nondescript exit door, and that would be your exit. Finding your way from where Bernard entered all the way to the exit of the mall would be challenging for someone thinking clearly, and clearly Bernard was not. Bernard was confused and likely really didn't understand where he was or what he was doing or why he was there, and so he did not follow these directions. Instead, he just began wandering down the hallway, and he would have immediately passed the one stairwell that would have very circuitously brought him down but out of the building. He passed that stairwell, and he just kept on walking, and eventually he walked into this staff-only area, which was even more confusing because there was no signs telling him where to go, and virtually every door he encountered would have been locked. And so as Bernard wandered through this concrete maze and got more and more mixed up and confused, he most likely began yelling out for help. But his sound could not have penetrated the walls, which means the only people who could have heard his cries would have been people inside the hallway with him. And unfortunately, this section of tunnels that Bernard had found himself in was rarely, if ever, used by any of the staff. And to make matters worse, the mall security guards were supposed to come in and do regular checks of all these 8 miles of tunnels and stairwells, specifically to see if people got lost in them. But over time, the security guards kind of stopped doing that. And there were no security cameras inside of this particular segment of tunnels that Bernard found himself in. and there was no cell phone reception, so had he tried calling anyone, it wouldn't have worked. And so truly, Bernard was on his own. And so after several hours or days of Bernard aimlessly wandering around this maze, hitting dead end after dead end and reaching locked door after locked door, Bernard at some point turned a corner and looked down at the end of a hallway, and he saw there was a chair up against the side of the wall. And like he was programmed to do anytime he got confused, he rushed over to it and he sat down and he began waiting for a passerby to help him or his family to find him. But unfortunately, help never came, and he would eventually pass away on that chair. On January 27th, that maintenance worker, he discovered Bernard's body. Following his death, the Westfield Center Mall came out and said they made drastic changes to their security system and how they track people while they're on their property. So that's going to do it, guys. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to do the like button's eyeliner, but use a wide tip black Sharpie. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 1 or 2 video uploads. We are now selling merchandise like flannels and hats and all sorts of stuff. If you're interested, go to shopmrballen.com. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's just MrBallen. I also have a TikTok account with tons of content. My username over there is also MrBallen. We have a second YouTube channel just called MrBallen Shorts, where we post random short videos and lost episodes. We also have a Facebook page which posts condensed versions of the longer episodes you see on YouTube. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.